Rick stood at the edge of the window, the quiet hum of the universe pressing against his ears. The moonlight was soft, almost like it was afraid to fully show itself, as if it too feared what was lurking just out of sight. Outside, the stars blinked lazily, distant and indifferent as they always had been. But tonight they felt different. Tonight they seemed to whisper, though Rick couldn't quite catch their words. He ran a hand through his graying hair, the weight of years long past pressing down on him. It wasn't the weight of age, it was something else, something more personal, something inside him that had been buried deep for longer than he cared to admit. The burden of time, maybe. Or the burden of knowing that there were no more grand adventures left for him, no more endless worlds to explore, no more mysteries to solve. The realization was simple, but it was a slow burn, a fire he had ignored for far too long. And yet there was peace in this small, dimly lit room. The peace of no longer running, no longer escaping. He turned away from the window, his movements slow, deliberate. The room, quiet as it was, felt alive in its own way. A quiet pulse. He had filled this space with pieces of his past. Broken gadgets, half-empty bottles, papers filled with scribbled equations and ramblings about the nature of reality. It was all there, every failed attempt, every calculated risk, and every moment he'd spent chasing something elusive. There was no room for regret here, just a strange sense of finality. Rick moved to the desk, reaching for an old glass vial. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up, a faint trace of dust coating the glass. Inside, a small pulsing blue light flickered, a device he had once promised never to use again. It had been his greatest achievement, the one thing that had made him feel truly alive, the one thing that had led him to the place where he now stood, the multiverse stabilizer. A device capable of altering the very fabric of existence, capable of rewriting timelines, reshaping worlds. He had outrun it, outrun the consequences, outrun everything that came with it. But now, in the quiet of this room, with nothing left but time and silence, he could no longer escape its pull. As his fingers traced the edges of the vial, his mind wandered back to the moment when it all began. When the first spark of curiosity ignited, and he found himself standing at the precipice of something far greater than himself. The first time he realized that the universe was more than just a collection of stars and planets. It was a story that could be shaped, twisted, bent to his will. That was when the adventure had begun, and that was when it had ended. Rick let out a slow breath, almost a sigh as he carefully placed the vial back on the desk. He had always been a man of science, a man of logic. But somewhere along the way, logic had stopped making sense. The equations stopped adding up, the patterns stopped aligning, and what had once been a brilliant mind, forever untethered by the confines of reality, had been slowly corroded by the very things he had sought to control. He glanced once more at the moon outside, its pale light now spilling across the floor, casting long shadows. There was something in the quiet, in the stillness, that made him feel human again. Not the mad scientist, not the renegade genius who had outrun the multiverse, but just Rick, the man who had once believed that he could change everything, that he could fix it all. But perhaps the thing that needed fixing was not the universe. Perhaps it was himself. And maybe, just maybe, the way forward wasn't through the next great invention or the next grand escape. Perhaps it lay in something simpler, something quieter, the kind of thing he had always dismissed in his relentless pursuit of answers, a connection. A soft knock at the door startled him. It was faint, almost as if the sound were hesitant, unsure of itself. Rick's heart skipped, though he quickly dismissed it. No one had come looking for him in years, not since he had locked himself away in this corner of the multiverse. "Come in," he called, his voice hoarse from disuse. The door creaked open slowly, and a small figure stepped into the room, casting a long shadow across the floor. It was Morty, looking a bit older than Rick remembered, but still carrying that same nervous energy. He stood at the doorway, unsure, as if waiting for permission to step further into the room. Rick stared at him for a moment. Morty was the one constant, the one person who had never truly left, even when Rick had tried to push him away. The boy who had once followed him through every universe, every dimension, now seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of everything they had seen had taken its toll. "What are you doing here, Morty?" Rick asked, his voice softer than he intended. I just wanted to check on you, Rick," Morty said, shuffling his feet awkwardly. "I know you've been alone for a while now. Just wanted to make sure you're all right." Rick couldn't help but let out a small, dry laugh. "You know, Morty, I've never been all right, but I'm not dying anytime soon if that's what you're worried about." Morty stepped into the room, his eyes darting to the vial on the desk before meeting Rick's gaze. I know things haven't always been easy, but you don't have to do this alone, you know? You've got people who care about you." Rick looked at Morty, his expression unreadable. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to push the boy away. Instead, he just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "I know, Morty," Rick said quietly. "I know." And in that moment, with the moonlight streaming through the window and the silence enveloping them both, Rick realized something. Maybe the answer wasn't out there in the multiverse, in the endless worlds and possibilities. Maybe the answer was right here, right in front of him. In the simple act of being seen, of being heard. The quiet hero's journey wasn't always about grand adventures or flashy battles. Sometimes it was about the small moments, the ones that were easy to overlook, but impossible to ignore once you truly saw them. And for the first time in a long time, Rick felt a small sense of peace, as if the weight of the multiverse had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Rick sat back down in the chair, the worn leather creaking beneath him. He could feel Morty's presence now, like a soft weight in the room. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was the kind of quiet that held no judgment, no expectations, just the space to breathe, to exist, without the pressure of everything else pressing in. It had been a long time since Rick had allowed himself such a simple luxury. "Look, Rick," Morty began, his voice quiet, hesitant. "I know you've been running from something for a long time, but you don't have to do it alone. You've got me and, well, maybe there's still time for us to figure things out." Rick looked at Morty, really looked at him for the first time in a long while. The boy had grown, not in the way Rick had expected, not in any obvious physical sense, but in the way he carried himself now. He wasn't the same anxious, wide-eyed kid who had once followed Rick through every universe without question. There was a quiet strength in him now, an understanding of the weight of things. "Maybe you're right," Rick said, his voice low and rough. He took a deep breath, staring out the window once more. The stars were still there, distant and unchanging, but in this room, in this moment, they didn't seem quite so far away. "I've spent so much time trying to outrun the consequences of my actions," Rick continued, his words careful as though he were testing them. "And the truth is, Morty, I don't know if I can keep doing that forever. I've burned so many bridges. It's like every time I take a step forward, it feels like I'm moving farther away from myself, from what I really want." Morty shifted slightly, his gaze never leaving Rick. "And what is it you really want, Rick?" he asked, almost as if he had already known the answer. Rick's heart tightened and he turned to face Morty more fully. He didn't answer immediately, instead choosing to look at the small, still form of the vial on the desk. It was a relic of the past now, a reminder of everything he'd once believed was possible, but even it, with all its power and potential, felt insignificant in comparison to the quiet certainty that had settled in his chest. "What I really want, Morty," Rick said, his voice soft, "is peace. Not the kind that comes from running, away from everything, but the kind that comes from just being. No more gadgets, no more inventions, no more endless chasing after things I'll never catch." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. It felt strange saying them aloud. But it also felt right. "So I've spent so much time looking for something to fix," Rick continued, his tone steady now, as if he were finally letting go of the tight grip he'd held on the past. "But maybe the thing that needs fixing isn't the universe, Morty. Maybe it's me. Maybe I've been so busy trying to shape the world I forgot how to just live in it." There was a long silence after that, a moment where the weight of Rick's words hung between them like the heavy stillness of a coming storm. Morty didn't rush to fill the space with words, as he might have once done. He simply sat there, looking at Rick with a quiet understanding in his eyes. "I think I get it," Morty said at last, his voice soft but filled with something that Rick couldn't quite place. It wasn't pity or concern. It was something deeper. It was recognition. "You don't have to fix everything, Rick. Maybe it's okay to just be." Rick's chest tightened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt the smallest flicker of hope. Maybe Morty had it right. Maybe this wasn't about fixing the unfixable. Maybe it was about learning to let go of the need to control everything, to allow life in all its messiness to simply unfold. "Maybe you're right, Morty," Rick said again, but this time the words felt lighter. "Maybe that's all I've ever needed. Just space to breathe." They sat together in the quiet for a while longer, the only sound in the room the gentle ticking of an old clock on the wall. Outside, the stars continued their steady dance, oblivious to the moments passing within the walls of Rick's small room. And yet there was something about it, the stillness, the quiet acceptance, that made it seem as though the universe in its vastness had given them this moment. Rick shifted in his chair, glancing over at the vial once more. It was still there, still glowing faintly, but its importance seemed to fade with each passing second. The real journey wasn't in the stars. It wasn't in the gadgets or the worlds he had once created and destroyed. It was here, with Morty, in this quiet room, in this simple, unspoken connection. "You know, Morty," Rick said after a long pause, his voice thoughtful, "maybe there's something to be said for stillness, for the kind of peace that doesn't come from running." Morty nodded, his eyes soft. "Yeah, I think I understand now. Maybe peace is just learning to be with what is instead of always fighting it." Rick smiled, a small, genuine smile that didn't come easily, but that felt right. "I think you're right, Morty." And with that, the room grew even quieter. The world outside still spun, but for Rick and Morty, time seemed to slow. In that quiet, there was something profound, something simple, yet deeply profound. It wasn't about fixing the broken parts of the multiverse. It wasn't about conquering it or escaping it. It was about being in it. Just being. Rick leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for the first time in a long while. And in that silence, in that peace, he finally allowed himself to just be. The minutes stretched out between them, the weight of their shared silence settling comfortably in the air. Outside, the night deepened, and the stars seemed to glow a little brighter, as if listening to the quiet exchange. Rick had closed his eyes, but even without seeing the world, he could feel it, the stillness of it all. The room, the light, the gentle rhythm of time itself. Everything had settled into a pace he hadn't known he could allow himself to experience. Morty shifted in his seat, and though Rick didn't open his eyes, he could sense the boy's thoughts, the unspoken questions that still lingered in the air. They had come so far, both of them, yet there was still so much left unsaid. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded answers. It was more like the kind of quiet you only found after a storm, when everything had calmed, and you could finally take a breath, a sigh of relief. "Rick," Morty's voice broke the stillness, tentative but full of care. "I've been thinking about everything, about the universes, about us." Rick opened his eyes slowly, catching Morty's gaze. There was a seriousness in the boy's expression, something far beyond the usual uncertainty. This was a different Morty, a version that had grown up quietly alongside him, even when Rick hadn't been looking. "What is it, Morty?" Rick asked, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know how to explain it, but after everything we've seen, all the places we've been, I think I finally get why you never wanted to settle down, why you always kept moving. It's not because you didn't care," Morty said, his words soft but clear. "It's because you were running from something you couldn't fix." Rick blinked, a little taken aback by the clarity in Morty's voice. For a moment it felt like the universe itself had paused, allowing the weight of Morty's words to sink in fully. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't even a challenge. It was just a simple truth, one that Rick had known for a long time but had never been able to say aloud. "Yeah, maybe I was," Rick said finally, his voice quiet but not heavy with regret. He sat up straighter, rubbing his face with his hands. Maybe I've spent my whole life thinking I could outrun everything, but you're right, Morty. You can't outrun yourself, not forever. Morty nodded slowly, looking down at the floor, then back up at Rick. I've been thinking about what you said, Rick. About peace, about just being. I think we can find it, you know? We can find a place where we don't have to keep running. Rick was silent for a moment, his mind spinning with thoughts that felt foreign to him now. The idea of staying, of not running, he had never truly allowed himself to consider it. He had always seen movement as the answer, always believed that forward was the only direction worth going. But now there was something softer in Morty's words, a gentle suggestion that perhaps the right direction wasn't always the fastest one. Maybe you're right, Rick said again, the words feeling less like an admission and more like a possibility. Maybe there's a place where we don't have to keep chasing everything. Maybe there's a way to just be here. He paused, looking out the window again, his gaze lingering on the faint glow of the stars. I've always thought that peace meant stopping the chaos, controlling everything, bending it to my will. But maybe it's not about control, maybe it's about letting go. There was a long silence again, but it wasn't an uncomfortable one. It felt more like a space where thoughts could settle, like the calm after a wave has passed. I think we can do it, Morty said quietly, as if the words were a promise, not just to Rick but to himself. I think we can find that peace, together. Rick looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time he saw the depth in Morty's eyes, the weight of the experiences they had shared, the unspoken bond that had grown between them. Over all these years, in that moment something inside Rick shifted. The world, which had always seemed so vast, so unmanageable, suddenly felt a little smaller, a little more reachable. Rick didn't speak for a long time. He didn't need to. The answer was already there, in the quiet acceptance that filled the space between them. I think maybe it's time to stop running, Rick said softly, and to start figuring out how to just live. Morty smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. And it wasn't the nervous, uncertain smile of the boy who had first stepped into Rick's life. It was the smile of someone who had learned, in his own way, what it meant to find balance in the chaos. The room seemed to breathe with them, a soft, steady rhythm. Outside, the stars glittered in their silent dance, untouched by time, yet part of it all the same. Rick and Morty sat together, not in silence now, but in something deeper, something more real. The unspoken agreement that this moment, this space was enough. Rick felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, an almost imperceptible weight lifting from his chest. It wasn't that everything was fixed or that the world was suddenly perfect. It was just that, for once, it didn't need to be. They didn't need to fix the universe. Not tonight, not here. They just needed to be. And maybe that in itself was the greatest adventure of all. The room grew quieter as the night deepened, the soft hum of the universe now a distant, familiar pulse that Rick could almost feel through his bones. It was as if the very air had softened, wrapped in a layer of peace he hadn't known he could find. Outside, the stars hung in the sky like distant promises, unchanging, yet ever present. It was a feeling Rick hadn't experienced in so long. Contentment. Pure and simple. He turned his attention back to Morty, who was still sitting across from him, his eyes a little brighter now, the weight of something unspoken lifting between them. The tension had melted away, leaving room for something gentler, something more grounded. So, Rick began, his voice quieter now, less like the sharp-edged scientist of old and more like, well, something else. Someone else. You're really serious about this, huh? About us finding peace, about staying? Morty nodded, a small but resolute movement. Yeah, I think I am, Rick. I think I've finally figured out that peace isn't something you find by running to the next big thing. It's something you find by being with the people who matter, by being present. Rick let the words sit with him for a moment. Morty was right, of course. The pieces had been falling into place for a while now, but it was only in the quiet of this moment that Rick could see the shape of them. The world, with all its noise and distractions, had kept him from seeing it, from understanding the depth of the connection he shared with Morty. It wasn't about escaping into another adventure or another world. It was about the here and now, about being with those who mattered most. He rubbed his eyes, a familiar gesture, but this time it felt different. There was no longer a frantic need to escape, no urge to grab for the next great thing, the next brilliant invention. All that mattered was here in this room, in this space. "I've been running so long, Morty," Rick said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's time to stop. Maybe it's time to let go of the things I thought I needed and just be with you, be with what's real." Morty looked at him with those quiet, knowing eyes, as though he had already figured it out long before Rick had spoken the words aloud. "We're here, Rick. That's all that matters, and we're not alone." The truth of it was simple, yet it carried a weight Rick hadn't fully appreciated until now. He had spent so many years seeing himself as a lone wanderer, detached from everything, convinced that he needed to be apart from the world to make a difference. But the real difference, the one that mattered, wasn't in what he could change about the universe. It was in what he could change within himself. The stars outside, as distant and unchanging as they seemed, were more than just cold, indifferent lights in the sky. They were a reminder of the vastness of it all, the endless possibilities, and yet here in the stillness of this small room, Rick realized that the true beauty of life wasn't in the endless chase. It was in the moments that grounded you, in the quiet spaces, in the people who made the journey worth it. "I never thought I'd be here, Morty," Rick said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Not like this, not content. But I'm starting to see it. I'm starting to see that maybe the peace I've been looking for was always here. Maybe it's always been in these moments, in the stillness, the quiet." Morty smiled again, the smile of someone who had always known this truth, even when Rick had been too caught up in his own head to see it. "You don't have to do it. All, Rick. You don't have to fix everything. Just be here with me." Rick took a deep breath, letting it fill his lungs before releasing it slowly. The weight of his years, the countless universes, the endless experiments and failures, they all seemed to fade into the background. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to carry it all. For the first time, he felt light. "We can find peace, Morty," Rick said softly. "Not by running from everything, but by finding our place in it, by understanding that we don't have to change everything to be content. We just have to find the right pieces." They sat together in silence again, the world outside continuing its steady, indifferent motion. But here, in this small room, Rick felt a sense of stillness settle over him. It wasn't the kind of peace he had once searched for in the distant corners of the multiverse, in the galaxies and worlds he had tried to control. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from fixing things, from making everything perfect. No, the peace he had found was simpler than that. It was the peace of being here, of being with Morty, of accepting that the world would never be perfect. But that was okay, that was more than okay. And in that moment, Rick allowed himself to rest. Not from exhaustion, not from the weight of his past, but from the constant need to prove something to himself, to the universe, to everyone. "I think we're going to be okay," Rick murmured, as much to himself as to Morty, and for the first time in his life, he believed it. The stars outside twinkled quietly, as if in agreement, while the moon's soft light bathed the room in a gentle glow. Time passed, but it no longer mattered. Rick wasn't running anymore. He was exactly where he needed to be. The quiet that had settled over them seemed to deepen as the hours passed, though neither Rick nor Morty felt the need to speak anymore. Time, in this small room, had become something fluid, less like a force that could be counted or measured, and more like a gentle tide that simply rose and fell in the background, unnoticed. The weight of the day's revelations, of the moments they had shared, hung in the air, weaving a subtle bond between them. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel heavy, but soothing, a silence that didn't need words to fill it. Rick leaned back in his chair, his hands resting in his lap, eyes closed. He felt something that was unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Peace. It wasn't something he had ever thought of as a destination, something you could arrive at. But here it was, quietly wrapping around him like a blanket. He couldn't pinpoint when the shift had happened, when the constant need to escape had finally ceased. But it had. And now the weight of the multiverse, the endless chase, the need to control everything, no longer pressed against his chest. He could hear Morty moving in the background, the boy's quiet steps barely making a sound on the worn floorboards. It was a soft rhythm, a rhythm that reminded Rick of something else, the way life had always been so loud, so fast, the relentless pursuit of something just out of reach. But now, in this quiet room, Rick realized how much he had missed the simple things, the small, ordinary moments that made up the fabric of everyday life. "Rick," Morty said, his voice breaking the stillness, but gentle, like a soft breeze. Rick opened his eyes, turning his head just slightly toward him. Morty stood by the window now, his back to Rick, looking out into the night. There was something contemplative in his posture, like he was taking it all in. The night, the stars, the stillness. "What's on your mind, Morty?" Rick asked quietly, his voice calm and steady. "I've been thinking about all those worlds we've seen," Morty said, his tone far softer than usual. "All the places, the people. It's kind of overwhelming, you know? But at the same time, I feel like I finally understand something I didn't before. I don't have to see everything. I don't have to chase it all. I don't need to go out and change the world. I just need to be a part of it, to be present in it." Rick sat up a little straighter, his gaze fixed on Morty's back. "That's a big realization, Morty," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "You know, I've spent so many years chasing after things that seemed bigger than me, bigger than anything. But the truth is, I think what you're saying is what I've been trying to outrun my whole life. I've been so obsessed with fixing everything except myself. And now I'm realizing, maybe I don't have to fix anything. Maybe I just have to live." Morty turned then, his face soft, a small smile forming on his lips. "Exactly, Rick. You don't have to fix everything. Sometimes it's enough to just be with it, be with what's right in front of you." Rick exhaled deeply, letting the words settle in his mind. For so long, he had been convinced that the only way forward was through action, through inventions, through running from one world to the next. But now, in the stillness of this room, in the quiet presence of Morty, Rick felt the weight of all those years of running finally lift. It wasn't a grand moment of realization, but something more subtle. It was a shift, a gentle exhale, like the closing of a door that had been left open for too long. I think you're right," Rick said softly. "I don't need to be out there changing everything. Maybe all I need to do is stop and let life come to me, and maybe that's enough." For the first time in a long while, Rick's thoughts weren't racing. There were no new ideas, no new experiments to start. There was just the moment. And in that moment, it felt like everything had fallen into place, like the pieces of his life were finally fitting together in a way that made sense. For so long, he had believed that peace was something you had to fight for, something you had to achieve. But peace, he was beginning to realize, wasn't a destination. It was a state of being, a way of existing without the constant need to push forward. Morty's smile widened as he came over to sit beside Rick. The two of them sat in silence for a while, side by side, just listening to the quiet of the night. The stars outside twinkled softly, as if to remind them of the vastness of it all, but also of how small and fleeting each moment truly was. "I'm glad we're here, Rick," Morty said after a while, his voice breaking the silence once again. "I'm glad we're not running anymore." Rick turned his head slightly, meeting Morty's gaze. There was something different in the boy's eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the familiar mixture of uncertainty and hope. It was something deeper, something more knowing. Morty had always been the one who followed Rick, unsure of himself, unsure of the world. But now in the stillness, in this shared peace, Morty had become something else, someone who had found his own way, someone who had learned to stop chasing the unknown and start living in the moment. "I'm glad too, Morty," Rick said, his voice warm but still carrying the weight of years spent running. I think we've both found something here, something that's worth more than all the worlds we've been to." They sat there for a while longer, the stars above casting their faint light through the window. There was no rush now, no urgency, just the quiet, steady rhythm of life moving forward, one moment at a time. And for the first time in Rick's life, he realized that maybe that was all he needed. No grand adventures, no far-off worlds to conquer. Just this, just the quiet, steady presence of the world around him, and the peace that came with accepting it. The room was still, but it no longer felt empty. In the quiet, there was an understanding between Rick and Morty, something that hadn't existed before, something that didn't need to be said aloud to be felt. They had both, in their own way, come to terms with the silence that filled the sea, space around them, and for the first time it didn't feel like an absence. It felt like a presence, one that was comforting, grounding, almost like a second breath. The soft ticking of the clock on the wall, the rhythmic rise and fall of their breathing, the faint rustling of the fabric of Morty's shirt as he shifted. Beside him, these small sounds seemed to fill the room more completely than any conversation ever could. For the first time in a long time, Rick felt no need to fill the silence. There were no pressing thoughts racing through his mind, no inventions waiting to be created, no experiments waiting for completion. There was only the here and now, the quiet, the stillness, the soft glow of the moon outside. "Rick," Morty said, after a while his voice breaking the silence again, but this time it felt more like a soft thread being gently pulled between them. "I know things haven't always been easy, but I think we're finally where we're supposed to be." Rick turned his head slightly, just enough to catch Morty's eyes. There was a certain weight to Morty's words, an acknowledgement of everything they had been through. They had both walked a long, hard road to get here, and in a way, it was as though they were standing at the end of it, looking back. But Rick realized as he gazed at Morty that there was no regret in the boy's expression, no yearning for the past. Morty had found something here, too, something that didn't need to be explained. It was simply understood. Rick thought for a moment, considering Morty's words. "Maybe we have," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Maybe this is what we were meant to find. Not all the answers, not all the solutions, just this. Just being here together." The night outside continued its slow passage, the stars still casting their soft light over the world. It was as if the universe itself was giving them space, to breathe, to settle, to simply exist in this quiet corner of time. "You know, Morty," Rick continued after a beat, the words coming more easily now, "I used to think that the universe owed me something. I thought that if I could just crack the code, figure out the mystery, I'd finally have the peace I've been searching for. But maybe it's not about finding the answers. Maybe it's about realizing that you don't need them, not the way you think you do." Morty nodded slowly, his face thoughtful, like he was processing the layers of meaning in Rick's words. "I get it, Rick. It's not about fixing things or making them perfect. It's about accepting things the way they are, about being okay with the unknown." Rick smiled, the smallest of smiles, but a real one. It was a smile that carried the weight of all the years he'd spent chasing, searching, and running. And now, it was a smile of understanding. "Yeah, Morty, I think you've got it. And maybe that's the hardest part." The silence returned, but this time it felt even more comfortable. The kind of silence that was full of knowing, full of acceptance. They didn't need to say anything more. The understanding was there, woven into the fabric of the room, in the quiet rhythm of their breaths. Outside, the world moved on, unaffected by the moments unfolding inside Rick's room. The stars remained as distant as ever, but now they felt less like cold, unreachable dots in the sky, and more like part of a larger story. A story that was still being written, one quiet moment at a time. And in that quiet, Rick allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in a long time. Grateful. Grateful for the moments he had shared with Morty. Grateful for the silence that had finally made room for something deeper. Grateful for the realization that, even without all the answers, he could still find peace. "You know, Morty," Rick said after a while, his voice more relaxed now, the edge of tension long gone. "Maybe I've been wrong all these years. Maybe I didn't need to keep running. Maybe what I needed all along was to just stay here, stay with you." Morty smiled again, a quiet, knowing smile that spoke volumes. "It's not too late. Rick, we're still here and that's enough." Rick nodded, his chest feeling lighter, almost like a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. It wasn't just the weight of the multiverse anymore, or the weight of all the failed experiments, the lost causes, the mistakes. It was something deeper, something softer. The weight of years spent chasing something elusive but never truly understanding what it was. The weight of running from the quiet, from the stillness, from the parts of himself he hadn't been ready to face. And now, in this moment, in this room with Morty sitting beside him, Rick understood. He didn't need to run anymore. He didn't need to fix the world or bend the universe to his will. He just needed to be with the world, to be with Morty, to be with himself. It was enough. The stars outside continued their endless dance, distant and eternal, but Rick no longer needed to chase them. The adventure had always been here, and in this quiet, in this stillness, he had finally found his way home. The night stretched on, unfolding slowly around them like the pages of an old book, each passing moment marking a new chapter in the quiet peace they had come to share. The stars outside blinked their silent rhythm, unaffected by the world inside the small room, yet somehow connected to it, as though they too understood the unspoken truth that hung in the air. Rick had never been one to seek out simplicity, but now, in the company of Morty and the stillness of this place, he could feel its presence. It was soft, almost like a dream he hadn't known he was living. As the night wore on, Rick found himself leaning back again in the chair, his eyes closed once more. He didn't need to fill the silence with anything, didn't need to chase it or analyze it. The quiet was enough. In a way, it had always been enough. He just hadn't known how to hear it before. It was a strange kind of clarity, one that wasn't found in answers but in acceptance. Morty's quiet movements beside him seemed to reflect this new understanding, his presence no longer anxious, no longer searching. It was as if Morty, too, had found his place in the world here in this moment. There were no more questions, no more uncertainties about what came next. They had arrived, if only for this fleeting moment, at the end of their journey, only to realize that this was the beginning of something else, something quieter, perhaps, but no less profound. You ever think about what happens after all of this, Rick? Morty asked, his voice soft but steady, breaking the silence without disrupting it. Rick opened his eyes slowly, looking over at Morty, who was gazing out the window once again. It was a question that lingered between them, one that didn't demand an answer, but simply asked them to consider the future. Not the grand, chaotic future of worlds colliding, of universes spinning out of control, but the small personal future that lay just ahead of them, in the quiet moments they had yet to experience. Rick thought for a long moment before speaking. "What happens after all of this?" he repeated, his voice thoughtful. "Well, Morty, I guess after all of this, we just keep going. Not with the same urgency, not with the same need to conquer or control everything, but just living, being part of it." Morty turned his head to meet Rick's gaze. There was no doubt in his eyes now, no uncertainty, just a calm, a peace that matched Rick's own. "That sounds all right to me." Rick chuckled softly, a sound that felt strange but comfortable, like the first warm breeze of spring after a long winter. "Yeah," he said, the word carrying more weight than it seemed. "Me too." The moon outside had shifted, its pale light casting new shadows in the room, and Rick felt something stir inside him, a feeling he couldn't quite place. It wasn't anxiety or fear. It was something else, something quieter, softer, something like the gentle pull of understanding that came with realizing how little they had truly known and how much there was still to discover in the simplicity of life. He stood slowly, stretching his legs with a soft groan, the familiar aches of age, reminding him that time was still moving, even if it felt like it had stopped for a moment. Morty stood with him, the two of them silently acknowledging the shared moment before they both moved toward the small kitchen area in the corner of the room. The kettle on the stove had long since cooled, but the comforting act of making tea, something so simple, so human, seemed to carry a weight now. It was a gesture, small but meaningful, that bound them together in this quiet space. As Rick prepared the tea, he found himself thinking of the years gone by, of all the places they had been, all the people they had met, and all the adventures they had shared. And yet, None of that seemed as important as the warmth of this moment, this simple act of making tea together. "Maybe this is what I've been missing all along," Rick muttered, almost to himself, as he poured the hot water into the cups. These small moments, the ones you don't think about, the ones you take for granted. Morty smiled softly as he sat at the small table watching Rick. "Yeah, I think we've both been missing this. We've been so focused on the big picture, on the next big thing, that we forgot how to just be here." Rick nodded, handing Morty a cup of tea before taking his own seat across from him. The steam rose from the cups in gentle tendrils, the warmth filling the air, the quiet between them stretching on, neither of them feeling the need to fill it. For once, there was no urgency, no pressure. There was only the simple act of being present. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The tea was warm, the night outside cool and quiet, and the world, for the first time in a long while, seemed like it was in balance. There was no grand plan, no need for grand adventures. There was only this: two people sharing a cup of tea, finding comfort in the silence and in each other's company. Eventually, Morty spoke again, his voice gentle, as if he didn't want to disturb the peace they had found. "Rick, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad we're here. You know that, right?" Rick looked at Morty, the boy's face open and sincere, and for a moment, the weight of his entire life seemed to rest in that simple exchange. The worlds. They had explored the multiverse they had outrun. All seemed so distant now. None of it mattered, not in the way it had once mattered. "I'm glad too, Morty," Rick said softly, his voice carrying the weight of everything he had never said before. "I don't think I ever really understood what it meant to be here, but I think I'm starting to get it now." They sat together in the quiet, sipping their tea, the world outside fading into the background. There was no rush anymore, no pressure. Just this moment, just them, and for Rick that was more than enough. The night continued its slow, steady passage, and the quiet in the room seemed to deepen with each passing hour. Rick and Morty sat together, their cups of tea now empty, but the warmth from them still lingering in the air. There was no rush, no sense of time slipping away. For the first time in a long time, Rick felt like he had all the time in the world, and yet he wasn't looking for anything to fill it. It was enough to simply exist, to be present in the room with Morty, in this space they had carved out for themselves. The moonlight had shifted, now casting a silver glow over the room, and Rick found himself staring at the window again, as though the night itself had become a part of him. The stars outside were still shining, but they didn't seem as distant as they once had. They weren't out of reach anymore, not in the way they used to be. In fact, they seemed almost close enough to touch, if only he could stretch his hand, far enough into the dark. Morty's voice broke the silence again, soft but steady. "Rick, do you ever wonder what comes next? Not in the big way, not in the big adventure way, but just next, like what we do after this, after everything?" Rick blinked slowly, his mind momentarily lost in the simplicity of the question. What came next? The future had always been a vast, unpredictable thing for him, filled with possibilities, each one as uncertain as the last. And yet, in this moment, the future didn't seem so distant. It felt a little more tangible now, like it was already here, unfolding with every breath he took. "I don't know, Morty," Rick said after a moment, his voice quieter than usual, reflective. I think maybe what comes next is just more of this. Not in the way you'd expect, not in the sense of what we've always done, but in the sense of just being, just living, without needing to chase it or make it into something." "Grand?" Morty nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful as he looked out the window. "Yeah," he murmured. "I think I get it. You don't have to keep moving all the time. You don't have to keep fixing things. You just let it be." The simplicity of Morty's words hung in the air, and Rick found himself smiling softly. He hadn't realized how much he had needed to hear that, how much he had needed to believe that the world didn't need to be fixed. Maybe the only thing that needed fixing was how he saw it. "Maybe you're right, Morty," Rick said softly, his smile lingering. "Maybe we've spent so much time trying to change the world, trying to make it into something we could control. But I think the real change comes from letting go of that, from letting it just be." They sat there in the soft glow of the moonlight, the room around them still and quiet, the night continuing its steady rhythm. Time seemed to slow, and for the first time, neither of them felt the need to rush, to fill the silence with words or actions. It was enough to just be here, to let the moments pass without the pressure of what was to come. Rick's thoughts wandered to all the years he had spent running, to all the worlds he had tried to conquer, all the mysteries he had chased, believing that they were the key to finding peace. But now it seemed like peace was not something you chased or found. It was something you allowed, something you accepted. And in this quiet room with Morty by his side, Rick realized that maybe the key to peace was as simple as just letting the world unfold as it was, without the need to control it. The stars outside seemed to shine brighter, as if in silent agreement with him. There was no more need for grand gestures, no more need for constant movement. All that mattered was the here and now. And in this moment, that was enough. "Rick, do you think we'll ever go back?" Morty asked quietly, breaking the stillness but not the peace. "To the adventures, I mean, to the worlds, to the multiverse?" Rick thought for a moment, the question stirring something in him, but not the usual urgency, not the usual craving for more. No, this time it felt different. "Maybe," he said slowly. "Maybe we'll go back. Maybe we won't. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we don't have to go anywhere to find what we're looking for. Maybe what we've been looking for is right here, in this moment." Morty was silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of Rick's words. "Yeah," he said finally, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, I think you're right." Rick turned his gaze back to the window, the moon now high in the sky, its light bathing the room in a soft glow. It was a quiet, peaceful night, and for the first time in his life, Rick didn't feel the need to chase anything. There were no distant worlds calling him, no adventures beckoning him forward. There was only the present, the stillness and the quiet satisfaction that came from realizing he had finally found what he needed. He sat there, letting the quiet fill the space, knowing that whatever came next, whatever the future held, he didn't have to face it alone. Morty was with him, and in this quiet room with the world outside, Rick had finally come to understand something he had never truly believed before, that peace wasn't something to be found out there. It was something you carried within you, something that could only be found when you stopped running long enough to let it settle in your soul. And so they sat, side by side, in the quiet of the night, as the universe continued its endless dance above them. And for the first time, neither of them felt the need to chase it. They were exactly where they were supposed to be. The night carried on, its passage slow and quiet, the silence between Rick and Morty no longer an awkward void, but a comfortable companion. The stillness in the room had settled deep into Rick's bones, a peace he hadn't known he could hold on to. The distant hum of the universe, once something he had fought against, something he had tried to outrun, now felt like a soft lullaby. Each breath he took felt deeper, more purposeful, as though he was syncing with the pulse of the world around him. It was the strangest feeling, this calm, this contentment. For so long, Rick had believed that he needed to do more, be more, that peace was something to be earned through struggle. But now it seemed so simple. It was here in this small room with Morty, the world outside irrelevant to the quiet truth they had both come to understand. Rick sat in the chair, his eyes fixed on the window again, watching the moonlight spill across the room, casting long shadows along the walls. Morty was still there beside him, but now he didn't feel like the anxious, uncertain boy who had once followed Rick through the chaos of the multiverse. Morty was here with him, and that was enough. There were no more unspoken questions in the air, no more uncertainty. For once the world felt small and quiet, and Rick realized that in a way that was exactly what he had been looking for all along. "I've been thinking about something," Rick said, his voice breaking the silence once more. "About all. The places we've been, all the things we've seen." Morty turned his head slightly, his gaze lingering on Rick as if waiting for him to continue. The question was there in his eyes, unspoken, but clear. Rick had spent so many years running, so many years chasing after something bigger, something he believed would give him the answers. And now, Here, in this quiet room, Rick felt that all of it, the endless worlds, the endless possibilities, had been part of a bigger picture he hadn't understood until now. "What about it, Rick?" Morty asked gently, his voice carrying that same calm, patient tone that had become their unspoken language over the last few hours. He wasn't impatient, not for answers or for the future. He was simply present. Rick leaned back in his chair, the gentle creak of the old leather almost too loud in the stillness. His eyes closed, and for a moment he let himself just be. Let the quiet fill him. Let the world outside stay where it was, distant, separate, but not irrelevant. He had never known this kind of peace before. It wasn't like the quiet of his lab, where the hum of machines was always present, always demanding attention. This was different. This was the quiet that came from knowing deep down that everything was as it should be, that nothing needed to be chased or fixed. "I think," Rick began slowly, choosing his words with care, "I think that what we've seen, Morty, isn't about understanding the universe. It's about understanding ourselves, about realizing that we've been running for so long, but there's nothing to outrun anymore. There's nothing we need to find, nothing we need to fix." Morty didn't say anything at first, but Rick could feel the weight of his words settling in, their meaning hanging in the space between them. The years of chasing answers, of seeking out the next great mystery or invention, had been a kind of distraction. A distraction from the most important thing, the simplest thing, the thing that had always been there, right in front of him: connection, understanding, being present. The world outside was still, and Rick found himself breathing a little deeper, letting the weight of the realization sink in. It wasn't about all the worlds they had seen, all the adventures they had lived. It was about the moments they had shared, the quiet connection that had formed between them. "I think I've been running away from peace," Rick said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "I've been so busy trying to outrun everything. My mistakes, my regrets, my fear of what would happen if I stopped moving, that I didn't realize that peace was here all along, right in front of me." Morty's gaze never wavered, his expression quiet but understanding. He hadn't needed to hear the words to know the truth of them. He had always known, even when Rick hadn't. "You know, Rick," Morty said after a long pause, "sometimes I think we're so busy looking for answers, we forget to just live, to just be part of the story instead of trying to control it." Rick nodded slowly, feeling the weight of Morty's words settle over him. It was as if Morty had always known, had always understood what Rick hadn't been able to see. They had both been running in their own ways, trying to outrun something, trying to make sense of a world that was too vast, too unpredictable. But in this moment, with Morty beside him, with the world outside silent and still, Rick realized that the answers hadn't been in the chase. They had been in the stopping, in the quiet, in the understanding that sometimes you didn't have to fix everything. For the first time, Rick felt the world's weight lift, not because it had changed, but because he had stopped trying to change it. The universe, with all its chaos, was still there, but it no longer had control over him. He had finally let go. He had finally realized that peace wasn't something to be found in another dimension or in the pursuit of answers. It was something that came from within, from being present, from accepting what was and letting go of what wasn't. As the night continued, Rick sat there side by side with Morty in the quiet of the room. The stars outside seemed to shine a little brighter, and the moon's soft light bathed the room in a glow that was almost ethereal. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. They weren't chasing it. They weren't running from it. They were simply here, and for Rick that was enough. The night stretched on, but the quiet was no longer oppressive. It was a comfort. The hours passed like a soft ripple on a still pond, the stillness not empty but full, rich with the gentle understanding they had both found in each other's presence. The moon outside continued its slow, steady arc across the sky, casting a pale glow over the room, but it was no longer the cold, distant light of an uncaring universe. It felt warmer now, softer, like an old friend offering solace. Rick had always been someone who thrived on movement, on the chase, but now the stillness felt different. It wasn't stifling as he had once believed it would be. It was freeing. For the first time in a long while, He wasn't looking for something more, something out there. He wasn't trying to solve the unsolvable or outrun the inevitable. He was simply here. And Morty, still beside him, had become a quiet mirror, reflecting back the peace that Rick had always overlooked. They didn't need to speak much now. Words weren't necessary. Not when the understanding was so clear between them. There was no rush to fill the space with noise, no need to move forward at breakneck speed. For once, they could both just let the world be as it was. "You know, Rick," Morty said, breaking the silence with a softness that matched the mood of the room, "I used to think we had to keep moving, that the next big thing was always just ahead, waiting for us, but now I think I understand. Maybe there's nothing to chase anymore. Maybe we've already found what we needed." Rick turned, his head slightly looking at Morty, but didn't say anything right away. The words felt too small, too inadequate to express everything he was feeling. Morty's quiet realization, the way he had grown, the way he had learned to let go of. The chase, it all mirrored Rick's own journey. And in that moment, Rick realized how much Morty had already taught him without even knowing it. "I think you've got it, Morty," Rick said softly, his voice carrying a quiet weight. "For the longest time, I thought peace was something I had to find, something I had to earn. But now I see that peace isn't something out there. It's something you make for yourself. It's something you find when you stop running." Morty nodded, his eyes thoughtful but calm. "Yeah, I guess we both had to learn that, huh?" Rick smiled faintly, the expression soft and genuine. "We did," he said, his voice more reflective now, as though he was still trying to fully grasp the weight of it. "We've spent so much time running, so much time searching for answers that we couldn't see what was right in front of us. Sometimes the only thing you need is to stop, to let everything settle." The room around them felt somehow different now. It was the same room, the same small space, but it had transformed. It was as though the quiet had given it new life, a new kind of meaning. It wasn't a place of isolation anymore, a place to hide away from the world. It had become a sanctuary, a space of understanding, of acceptance, of peace. Outside, the wind had begun to pick up, a soft breeze stirring the leaves in the trees outside. But it was still somehow a gentle reminder of the world's rhythm. The night wasn't about rushing anywhere. It was about existing in the moment just as it was. Rick had never known that kind of peace before, never understood that the moments in between, the ones that seemed small, insignificant, were the ones that mattered the most. Rick turned his gaze back to the window, the stars now dimming as the first light of dawn began to creep into the sky. The night had passed, but it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. The stillness wasn't an absence of movement. It was a space for something new to grow. "We've been to so many places, Morty," Rick said quietly, as though speaking more to the room than to Morty himself. "Seen so many things. But maybe what we needed most was never out there. Maybe it was always here, in the quiet, in the moments we've been too busy to notice." Morty, ever the quiet observer, took a slow breath and looked at Rick. "Yeah, I think we've been chasing the wrong things for so long, and now we're finally here." Rick let out a deep breath, the weight of the words slowly settling into his chest. "We're here," he repeated, the realization sinking in. And for the first time, he didn't feel the need to chase after anything else. The stars outside had faded, their light retreating as the first rays of the sun began to touch the horizon. The world was waking up, but Rick didn't feel the rush to join it. For once, the world could wake up without him. He didn't need to race ahead anymore. He could simply be. And in that stillness, as the room slowly brightened with the new day, Rick realized that for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he needed to be. The first light of morning crept through the window, soft and warm, scattering across the room like a gentle promise. Rick didn't rush to get up, nor did Morty. They sat there side by side, the room filled with a quiet kind of understanding, the air thick with the weight of the night they had shared. There was no hurry now, no need to get on with the next thing. For the first time, neither of them felt the pressure of time demanding their attention. The world outside could wait. They didn't need to go anywhere. The light slowly grew stronger, spilling over the desk where the vial still sat, faintly glowing in the quiet of the morning. Rick hadn't even thought about it for hours, hadn't felt the need to, not with the peace that had settled in the room. He found himself looking at it now, as if the vial, with its once important, once urgent purpose, was suddenly inconsequential. It was a relic, a reminder of a life he had left behind. A life that, for all its brilliance, had never brought him the peace he'd always thought he needed. "I used to think that thing," Rick muttered, nodding toward the vial, "was the answer, the key to everything. I was so sure of it. But now," he trailed off, his voice thick with something close to disbelief. "Now I don't even know what I was trying to solve." Morty glanced at the vial too, his eyes thoughtful. "I guess sometimes we think we're looking for something big, something life-changing, but maybe it's the small things that really matter, the stuff we don't even think about." Rick nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the vial. "Yeah, I spent my whole life thinking that I had to be the one to fix the world, to control everything. And all along I was missing the simplest thing, the most important thing." "What's that?" Morty asked, his voice quieter now, as if the question itself carried some weight, some significance. Rick turned to look at him, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips, but it was soft, almost imperceptible. "Connection, Morty. Being here, not running from everything, but just living in it, accepting it." There was a long pause, and the silence between them felt comfortable now, as though the world itself had paused to listen. The room, the light, the quiet, they all felt like part of the same quiet truth. No longer was there the weight of endless universes pressing down on Rick. No longer was there the need to chase the next mystery or invention. Everything had slowed, and for the first time, it felt right. As the morning sun began to bathe the room in a golden light, Rick stood up slowly, stretching his limbs as though waking from a long, restless sleep. Morty followed suit, and together they moved toward the window, looking out at the world beyond. The sky was clear, the city beneath them still in the early stages of waking up, the streets quiet and empty. "I've been to so many places, Morty," Rick said softly, more to the world outside than to Morty. "So many worlds, and they all felt so important at the time. But now, standing here, I realize that all those places, all those adventures, they don't matter like I thought they did. The only thing that matters is what's right here, right now." Morty stood beside him, looking out at the quiet world too, and for a long time neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The moment they had shared, the peace, the understanding, was enough. "Do you think we'll ever go on another adventure?" Morty asked after a while, his voice a little unsure but not fearful. There was no urgency in his tone, no desperation for what the future might bring. It was more like a thought, a curiosity about the possibilities but without the need to race ahead. Rick looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe. But it won't be like before, Morty. It won't be about running from something or chasing something we don't understand. If we go, it'll be because we want to, because we choose to." Morty nodded, his face softening. "Yeah, I think I get that." They stood there for a while longer, just watching the world outside, the early morning light slowly warming the streets below. The stillness around them felt like a gentle invitation, not a pause but a deep breath, a moment to take in everything they had been through, everything they had learned. Rick finally broke the silence, his voice quieter now, reflective. "No, Morty, there was a time when I would have looked at this moment and thought it was too simple, too easy. But now it feels like the most important thing. Just being here, with you." Morty smiled, his eyes calm. "Yeah, I think it's pretty important too." For the first time in a long time, Rick wasn't thinking ahead. He wasn't planning the next great invention or contemplating the endless possibilities of the universe. He was simply here. And it was enough. The world outside was waking up, the city below beginning to stir with the energy of a new day, but for Rick and Morty, the world could wait. They didn't need to chase anything. They had already found what they were looking for. They had found peace, and for the first time Rick understood what that really meant. The morning unfolded slowly, like a story stretching its pages, each second as soft as the last. Rick and Morty continued to stand by the window, the quiet between them no longer feeling like a void, but a space filled with understanding. The world outside was starting to wake up, quiet at first, then slowly gaining momentum, as all things do when the day begins. But inside the room there was stillness, a kind of peace that felt out of time, as though the outside world could keep spinning without them. They no longer had to chase it. Rick found himself breathing deeply, the air in the room cool and refreshing, untouched by the noise of what was coming next. For once there was no urgency, no need to rush forward, to solve the next puzzle or dive into the next universe. There was just the moment, and for the first time, he was present in it. I think... Rick began slowly, his voice soft as he broke the silence. I think I'm finally starting to understand what it means to be content, to just exist. Morty, who had been standing beside him, turned his head, a slight smile playing at the corner of his lips. It was a smile that held no uncertainty. Now no questions. He had become someone Rick could stand with, not as a follower or an apprentice, but as an equal. Someone who had learned, as Rick had, that peace wasn't something you chased, it was something you embraced. Yeah, Rick, Morty said, his voice gentle but firm. I think we've both been chasing the wrong things for a long time. Rick nodded, his gaze drifting from Morty to the light slowly filling the room. I spent so many years running from things, Morty, from the mess I made, from my own fears, from myself. I thought if I could just get to the next place, if I could just solve the next thing, everything would finally make sense. He paused, turning to face Morty fully now, the weight of those years settling in his chest. But it wasn't about solving the world's problems. It wasn't about finding the answer to the universe's mysteries. It was about letting go. It was about understanding that I don't have to fix everything, that sometimes the best thing I can do is just be. Morty's expression softened, and he nodded. There was a quiet understanding between them now, one that had grown over time, born from all the things they had been through. They had seen so much, and yet in this moment, the only thing that truly mattered was this, being here together in this shared understanding. I get it now, Rick, Morty said, his voice low but sure. We've spent so much time trying to outrun what we thought was the problem, but maybe the problem was just us running. Maybe the real thing to fix was the way we were living. Rick smiled faintly, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Maybe, Morty. Maybe. There was a long silence then, a quiet moment where neither of them felt the need to speak. The stillness wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was full, rich with the space they had created together. For the first time, Rick didn't feel like he had to explain everything. The understanding between them didn't need words to be complete. Rick turned his gaze back to the window, the outside world slowly coming to life as the first light of day spilled across the horizon. He watched the city below stir, the first sounds of the day, distant car engines, the murmur of people drifting up to them. It was a reminder that life continued, that the world would go on, but for the first time, it didn't feel like something he had to control. He wasn't in a race with time anymore. He wasn't chasing the next big thing, he was simply existing. And that, he realized, was enough. It's strange, Rick said after a while, his voice quiet again. I spent my whole life thinking that I had to solve everything. But now I think I was looking at it all wrong. The answers aren't in the solving. They're in the letting go. They're in the peace that comes with accepting that we don't have to fix the world to be part of it. Morty looked at him, his expression thoughtful but serene. Yeah, I think I've been trying to fix things too. But maybe the only thing we really need to fix is how we see it all. Rick let out a deep breath, the weight of years lifting slowly, bit by bit. He felt lighter, not because the world had changed, but because he had finally allowed himself to change. He had let go of the need to control, the need to outrun, and in that release he had found something far more valuable. As the light outside grew brighter, Rick and Morty stood there for a while longer, watching the world wake up below them. The room around them felt full in a way it hadn't before, not just full of silence, but full of something deeper, something that came from being content, from being present, from realizing that the world didn't need to be fixed to be beautiful. Do you think we'll ever go on another adventure? Morty asked quietly, his voice tinged with a curiosity that was no longer filled with urgency, but with gentle wonder. Rick turned to look at him, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to chase that question. He didn't feel the weight of having to answer it, to create a grand plan for the future. The future, whatever it was, would come, but for now, in this moment, they didn't need to chase it. "I don't know, Morty," Rick said slowly, his voice soft, almost absent of the edge it once had. "Maybe, maybe not, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that we're here right now, and that's enough." Morty smiled, a calm, contented smile, and for a moment the world outside didn't feel so big, so endless. It felt manageable, peaceful, just like this. And for Rick, that was more than enough. The day continued to unfold quietly around them. The light outside had softened into the warm hues of afternoon, casting a golden glow over the room. It was a stillness Rick had never truly known before, not this deep, this calm. The world outside carried on, as it always did, but here, in the quiet space they had created, there was no rush, no noise, just the peace that came from simply being, from living in the present moment without the weight of the past or the fear of what was to come. Rick stood by the window for a while longer, watching as the world below continued its slow dance of life, the cars, the people, the birds flying across the sky. All of it seemed so distant now, like something that was happening in another world, far from where he stood. He had always been so focused on that world, on the movement, the chaos, the noise of it all. But now, there was only this. The stillness. The quiet. "Rick," Morty's voice broke through the peace, soft but steady. "You ever wonder if we've been missing something all along? Something that we never thought was important until now?" Rick turned slowly, his gaze shifting from the window to Morty, who had taken a seat by the desk, his hands resting in his lap. There was something different in the boy's posture now. It wasn't the usual nervous energy, the anxious fidgeting Rick had come to expect. It was something calmer, something more grounded. "What do you mean?" Rick asked, his voice quiet, but curious, as if he was starting to understand where Morty was coming from. Morty looked at him, his eyes serious. I think we've been so focused on fixing the world, Rick, trying to make everything make sense. But maybe the real answer was just accepting it as it is, not needing to change it, just being a part of it." Rick studied Morty. For a moment, letting the words sink in. He had always believed that fixing things was the answer, that if he could just control the chaos, if he could just solve enough problems, everything would fall into place. But now, in the quiet of the room with Morty sitting beside him, it seemed like there was another answer, one he hadn't even considered before. The answer was in the acceptance, in letting go. "I think you're right, Morty," Rick said slowly, his voice quieter now. "I've spent so much of my life trying to control everything, to make it all fit together the way I thought it should. But maybe it's not about controlling anything. Maybe it's about letting go of that need, about being okay with things as they are." Morty smiled, a small but knowing smile. "Yeah, I think that's what we've been missing all along. The peace that comes with just being here. Not rushing, not running, just living." Rick looked out the window again, his gaze lost in the quiet city below. He could still hear the distant hum of life moving forward, but it didn't seem as overwhelming. Now it wasn't something he had to fix or chase. It was just there, happening, and he didn't need to be in the middle of it anymore. For the first time, he realized that he didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. He could let go of that burden. The world would continue without him, and that was okay. "You know, Morty," Rick said, his voice softer, now almost reflective. "I used to think that if I stopped moving, stopped trying to control things, I'd lose myself. I thought I needed to be the one to fix everything. But now, I think I've been running from the only thing that really matters, just living, just being part of it all." Morty looked at him, his eyes steady and understanding. "You don't have to fix everything, Rick. You never did. You just have to be here." Rick's chest felt lighter than it had in years. The weight of all his regrets, all the mistakes, all the things he'd never been able to change. It was All still there, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like part of the journey, part of the story. And in that moment, Rick realized something. All those years of running, of searching, of trying to control the uncontrollable, none of it had been necessary. The only thing he needed was to be present, to accept the world as it was, without trying to force it into something it wasn't. Rick turned back to Morty, the weight of everything he had ever known about life and the universe suddenly shifting. "I think I finally get it," he said, his voice quiet but full of realization. The thing I was missing wasn't out there in the stars, or in the next big invention, or the next world to conquer. It was right here, it was always right here. Morty nodded, his smile widening. "Yeah, I think I get it too. We were always looking for something more, something bigger. But maybe the best thing we can do is just be with what we have. Right. Now right here." Rick's gaze drifted once more to the window, to the city below, and for the first time in his life he felt no need to rush. The world would continue its journey, and he no longer needed to be the one to guide it. He could simply be part of it, a quiet observer in the vastness of it all. The stars, the sky, the noise of the city, it was all part of the same tapestry, and for once he didn't need to fix it. He just needed to live in it. And as the light outside grew brighter, marking the beginning of a new day, Rick felt a quiet peace settle over him, the kind of peace he had never known before, the kind of peace that came from letting go. With a deep, contented breath, Rick stood up from the chair, and Morty followed suit. They didn't speak for a while, but the silence between them didn't feel empty. It felt full, rich with understanding. They had both come to the same conclusion in their own ways. They had both learned that peace wasn't something you could chase or force. It was something you could only find when you stopped running. Together, they stood by the window, the city below now fully awake. But neither of them felt the need to rush into it. They had already found what they needed, and for Rick, that was more than enough. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting its warm light over the room. And yet time didn't feel quite as pressing as it had before. Rick and Morty still stood by the window, their eyes watching the world outside, but neither of them felt the need to rush into it. The city had woken up, as it always did, but it seemed far away now. The noise, the movement, the constant hum of life. It all felt like it belonged to another world, a world Rick and Morty were no longer trying to chase or change. They were simply here, present in this quiet space, sharing a moment that had stretched longer than either of them expected. For a while, there was no need for words. They had come to an understanding that didn't need to be explained. Rick didn't feel the weight of the past pressing on him anymore. He didn't feel the need to find some grand purpose in the future. He could simply exist, and that felt like enough. For the first time in his life, Rick understood that the universe didn't need to be conquered or fixed. It was enough to just be part of it. "I never really got it before," Rick said after a while, breaking the silence but not the peace. His voice was soft, almost reflective, as though the words had only just found their way to him. "I spent my whole life thinking I had to be someone different, someone bigger, someone who could change things, but all along what I needed was this, just being here, just being me." Morty turned his head to look at him, his eyes steady. "You've always been enough, Rick. You just didn't realize it." Rick let out a small, almost rueful chuckle. "Maybe I didn't. Maybe I've spent so much time thinking I needed to do more, be more, that I couldn't see what was right in front of me." He paused, looking back out the window, as if watching the world in a new way. "But now, I think, maybe it's time to stop looking for the next big thing. Maybe the only thing we need is right here in this moment." Morty nodded, a small, knowing smile on his face. He was no longer the wide-eyed, uncertain boy who had first followed Rick into the unknown. There was a calmness to him now, a quiet confidence that Rick hadn't noticed before, but that now felt just as important as the peace Rick had found in himself. "You know," Morty said slowly, his voice quiet but full of understanding, "when we were running around jumping through universes, I always thought we were looking for something. I thought there had to be something bigger, something we hadn't seen yet. But now I think we've already seen it. We were looking for answers, but maybe the answers were always here." Rick's heart felt a little lighter at Morty's words, a small weight lifting from his chest. Morty had always been the one who followed him, uncertain but eager to prove himself. And yet now, Morty was the one who seemed to understand the simplest truth, something that Rick had only just come to grasp. "Yeah," Rick murmured, more to himself than to Morty, though the boy could hear the weight of his words. "Maybe the answers are simpler than I thought. Maybe the universe doesn't need to be solved. Maybe it just needs to be lived in." There was a brief pause before Morty spoke again, his voice soft but clear. "Rick, do you think we're ever going to leave this place? I mean, what happens now? What happens when we've already found everything we needed?" Rick turned toward Morty then, meeting his gaze. It was a question that lingered between them, but it wasn't an urgent one. It was more of a quiet curiosity, the kind that only arises when you realize you've already found what you were searching for. "I don't know, Morty," Rick said slowly. "Maybe we will. Maybe we won't. But for now, I think we've done enough. We've been everywhere, seen everything. But maybe it's time to just stop, to just be here." Morty looked at Rick for a long time, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, maybe we don't need to go anywhere anymore. Maybe it's enough to just be here with each other." The words hung in the air, simple but heavy with meaning. Neither of them spoke for a while, the silence between them not uncomfortable, but rich with everything they had learned. The world outside had not stopped moving, but it no longer felt like something they had to chase. They didn't need to change it, control it, or run from it. It would keep moving with or without them, and that was okay. For the first time, Rick didn't feel the urge to push for more. He didn't feel the need to be somewhere else, to do something bigger. The quiet of the room, the steady rhythm of time passing felt like enough. There was no race, no destination. There was only the moment. And for once, Rick didn't need to understand it. He could just live in it. The sunlight continued to pour into the room, casting everything in a soft golden glow. The stars outside had long since faded from view, but the memory of them lingered in the quiet, in the understanding they had both found. The world was as it was. No more questions, no more answers needed. And in that peace, in that stillness, Rick finally allowed himself to breathe deeply, knowing that for once he didn't have to chase anything. The world could go on, but he had already found what he needed. The silence stretched on, the two of them standing side by side, and for the first time, neither of them felt the need to fill it. It was enough just to be. The room, bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun, felt like a haven, untouched by the restless energy of the world outside. The city below continued its dance, but for Rick and Morty, the noise of it all had faded into a distant hum, barely noticeable now. There was no urgency, no driving force to pull them forward into the next thing. They had arrived not at some grand destination, but at a quiet understanding of the present. It was as if time had paused, allowing them to exist in a world that no longer demanded anything from them, but simply offered itself in all its unhurried beauty. Rick took a deep breath, the air in the room carrying the soft scent of dust and time. It wasn't a suffocating air, but one that felt familiar, comfortable, as though it belonged to the years they had spent running from one place to another, never stopping long enough to realize what they were missing. Now, in the stillness, he could see it all for what it was, the chasing, the need to control, the constant striving for something that always seemed just out of reach. But now that had all faded. He didn't need to run anymore, there was nothing left to outrun. "It's funny," Rick said, his voice breaking the silence again, this time with a quiet laugh. "I spent all those years thinking I had to be something else, someone bigger, someone who could fix everything, and now I'm realizing that maybe the best thing I can do is just stop." Morty, still standing beside him, nodded slowly. His expression was calm, the same steady understanding that had been growing between them over the course of this quiet day. "Yeah, Rick, maybe we're not supposed to fix everything. Maybe we're just supposed to live in it, to be part of it without trying to change it." Rick looked at him, the truth of those words sinking in deeper than he had expected. It wasn't about fixing the world. It never had been. It was about being present in it, accepting it as it was, and finding peace in that acceptance. It felt like something he had always known, but had never really understood until now. The light in the room seemed to shift again, softening even more as the day drew to a close. There was no rush to move on, to do the next thing. The moments stretched out, and Rick realized he was no longer searching for the next great adventure or the next big question. He wasn't waiting for the world to give him an answer. He had already found it here in the quiet of the room, in the stillness between him and Morty. "You know," Rick said after a while, his voice soft with reflection, "I think the real adventure was never out there. It wasn't in the universes or the gadgets or the things I thought I could control. It was always about finding this, finding peace, finding stillness." Morty smiled gently, the same quiet understanding reflected in his eyes. "Yeah, I get that now too. We spent all that time running, thinking we had to solve everything. But what if the solution was always here? What if we've already found it?" Rick chuckled, the sound rich with a mix of humor and acceptance. "I guess we have, Morty, I guess we have." They both turned toward the window again, watching as the light continued to change, the city below slowly shifting from the stillness of afternoon to the quiet of evening. The world moved around them, but it no longer felt like something they had to chase. It wasn't something that would pass them by if they didn't keep moving. It would keep moving with or without them. And that was fine. They didn't need to race against it anymore. Rick felt a shift inside him, a deep, subtle shift that seemed to settle in his chest. The weight he had carried for so long, the weight of constantly striving, of always needing to be more, of always running from something, had finally lightened. There was no more pressure, no more need to be the one to fix it all. All of it, the mistakes, the regrets, the chaos, was a part of the journey. And he could accept that. "I'm not sure where we go from here," Rick said after a long pause, his voice thoughtful. "But I don't feel like I need to have it all figured out anymore. I'm okay with not knowing. I'm okay with just being here." Morty turned to him, a small smile on his face, his eyes steady and content. "I'm okay with that too, Rick." Rick let out a long breath, feeling a peace wash over him that he hadn't known was possible. He had spent so many years searching for something outside himself, something that would make it all make sense. But now, in the quiet of this room with Morty beside him, Rick realized that the search had never been for an answer. It had been for this, for the peace that came from letting go, from stopping the constant chase, and from simply being present. The room around them seemed to hum with the quiet of understanding. The light from the window bathed everything in a golden hue, and for the first time Rick didn't feel the need to do anything. He didn't need to fix the world. He didn't need to run. He just needed to be here. "I guess this is what it's all been about," Rick said almost to himself. "Not the inventions, not the multiverse, just this, being with you, Morty, being here." Morty nodded, the same quiet understanding reflected in his face. "Yeah, I think we've both found what we needed, Rick, and maybe that's enough." For the first time, Rick didn't feel the need to argue. He didn't need to question it. It was enough. They were enough. And in that stillness, in that acceptance, Rick knew that he had finally found peace. Not in the chase, not in the solving, but in the letting go, and for the first time in his life that felt like more than enough. The room had grown quieter with each passing minute, the soft glow of the evening sun casting long shadows on the walls. The city outside continued its hum, but inside the room there was only stillness, a stillness that felt like a peaceful kind of pause. Time no longer felt like something to be measured or raced against. It was just something that existed, quietly and unobtrusively in the background. Rick and Morty sat together, not speaking, but not needing to. They had found a rhythm in their silence, one that didn't require words to be understood. The weight of the world, the weight of the countless universes they had visited, of all the adventures and mistakes, no longer pressed on them. There was only this moment, this quiet. Rick let out a deep breath, his eyes still trained on the window. It was funny, he thought. All those years spent chasing something, chasing answers, chasing control, chasing meaning, and now here he was, sitting in the stillness, realizing that what he had been looking for was never something that could be found in motion. It had always been in the pause, in the quiet, in being present. "You ever think about what you'd do if you just stopped?" Rick asked, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "If you didn't have to, Run any more if you didn't have to chase anything? Morty didn't answer immediately. Instead, he seemed to turn the question over in his mind, as though it required more than a quick response. Finally, after a long silence, he spoke, his voice steady and reflective. I think I'd be okay with it. Not chasing, not fixing things, all the time. I think it would be enough to just live in it, to just be part of the world instead of trying to change it. Rick glanced over at him, his expression softening as he realized that Morty had, in a way, already answered his own question. The boy had always been the one to follow, the one who had learned from Rick's actions and mistakes. But now, in this moment, Morty seemed to be leading in his own quiet way. It was a calm kind of wisdom that Rick hadn't fully appreciated before. Morty was no longer the nervous, uncertain boy who had jumped at every opportunity for adventure. He was someone who had come to understand that the best things in life were often the simplest ones. I think you're right, Morty, Rick said, his voice soft with a new kind of understanding. Maybe that's what I've been missing. I've spent my whole life thinking I needed to chase something, always searching for something just out of reach. But what if it was always right here? What if the answer was just to stop? Morty nodded slowly, his eyes focused on the window as if seeing the world outside in a new light. Maybe the answer was never about finding something, Rick. Maybe it was about realizing that what we need is already here. It's in the people we care about. It's in the moments we share. It's in the quiet. Rick let those words settle, and he could feel the weight of them in a way he hadn't before. The quiet. He had always been afraid of it, always thought that silence meant something was missing, something had to be filled. But now in the stillness of the room, he understood that the quiet wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city outside seemed a million miles away, its noise fading into the background, as they sat together in the calm of the room. The world continued its motion, but here, in this space, there was no need to chase it, no need to outrun it. It was just enough to exist in it. Rick glanced at the desk, his eyes lingering on the vial once more. It had been his obsession, his focus, the key to everything he had once believed was important. But now it seemed almost irrelevant. The vial, the experiments, the inventions, they had all been part of a past Rick had left behind. He had always thought they held the answers, but now he understood. The answers weren't in the things he had built or the places he had been. They were in the people he had loved, in the connections he had made, in the quiet moments shared without words. Maybe it's time to let go of all of it, Rick said, his voice barely above a whisper. The inventions, the answers. Maybe it's time to let go of the need to fix things. Maybe we've already found what we were looking for. Morty turned to him, his expression soft. Yeah, Rick, I think we have. The sun outside had shifted, casting the room in a deeper, more peaceful light. The city below, once so full of noise and movement, now seemed distant. The noise was still there, but it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was this quiet understanding between them, this shared moment of peace that neither of them had to chase. It had arrived on its own, and they were ready for it. Rick took a deep breath, letting it fill his lungs. He could feel the weight of the past lifting, the pressure to chase the next thing slipping away. The world would continue to move. The universe would continue its dance, but Rick no longer felt the need to race ahead. He could finally let go. I'm not sure what comes next, Morty, Rick said slowly, his voice calm and unburdened. But I think I'm okay with it. I think I'm okay with just being here. With this. Morty smiled, the quiet understanding in his eyes reflecting everything they had learned together. Yeah, Rick. I think we both are. And for the first time in his life, Rick didn't feel the need to chase anything. He didn't feel the pull of the endless multiverse or the constant pressure to control everything. He had found something far more valuable, peace, in this moment, in the quiet. And for once that was enough. The day stretched lazily into the late afternoon, the sunlight now softening, the room wrapped in a gentle golden warmth. Outside, the world seemed to move with its usual rhythm, cars passing, people walking, the faint hum of life continuing. But inside the room there was stillness. It was the kind of stillness that didn't feel empty. It felt full, full of understanding, full of moments shared, full of a peace that neither of them had known they needed. Rick leaned back against the chair, his eyes drifting from the window to the room around him, as if seeing it all for the first time. The walls that had once felt confining now felt like a safe, familiar embrace. He had spent so much time searching for something outside of himself, something to give him answers, something to fix the chaos. But now in the quiet of this room with Morty beside him, he realized the answers weren't out there. They were right here, right in this moment. Morty was sitting at the desk, the soft light highlighting the thoughtful expression on his face. It wasn't the look of the boy who had once been anxious and uncertain. It was the face of someone who had grown, someone who had come to understand what it meant to just be. There was no rush, no need to get to the next thing. There was only the present. And for the first time, Rick realized how much he had underestimated the power of the present, how much he had spent running from it. "What do you think happens next, Rick?" Morty asked, his voice breaking the stillness, but not in a way that felt jarring. It was more of a gentle curiosity, a question that was less about what came next, and more about what they had already found. Rick didn't answer immediately. He was still processing the weight of Morty's words. The question had always seemed so heavy to him before, the future always a thing to be planned for, chased, understood. But now, with the quiet around them, the world outside seemed distant, irrelevant in the best way. There was no need to think about what came next. What mattered was what they had right now. "I don't know, Morty," Rick said, his voice soft, almost thoughtful. Maybe we don't need to think about it at all. Maybe what we've been looking for was never about finding something. Maybe it was about realizing that we already have what we need." Morty nodded slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to something softer, more knowing. "Yeah, I think that's it. We've been so caught up in the idea that there's something else we need to do, somewhere else we need to go. But what if this is it? What if we're already here?" Rick's smile was small but genuine. "I think you're right, Morty. Maybe we've been too busy looking for answers when all along the answer was just to stop." There was a long silence then, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, like two people sitting together, understanding each other without words. Rick could feel the shift within himself, the transformation from the man who had once felt the need to constantly move, to achieve, to conquer, to the person who could now simply be. And it wasn't just a weight being lifted, it was a kind of freedom. Freedom from the need to always look ahead, always chase after something, always run. For the first time, Rick didn't feel the pressure to find meaning. The meaning was already there, in the quiet, in the space they had created, in Morty, in the room, in the stillness. "I think we're finally getting it," Rick said softly, almost to himself. He wasn't talking to Morty, but Morty heard him all the same. "Yeah," Morty replied, his voice filled with a quiet kind of wisdom. "We are." Rick turned his gaze to the window again, the city below still bustling, but to him it was no longer an overwhelming force. It was just part of the world. The same world he had spent years trying to control, trying to fix, trying to make sense of. And now it was simply part of the story, not something to chase, not something to conquer, just something to exist in. He looked back at Morty, his eyes meeting the boy's with a new kind of understanding. Morty wasn't just the boy who followed him anymore. He wasn't just the one who tagged along on adventures, unsure of himself. He was someone who had grown alongside Rick, someone who had learned the same lesson, maybe even before Rick had. "You've come a long way, Morty," Rick said quietly. "I'm proud of you." Morty smiled, the smile of someone who had found peace in the quiet, in the simple act of being. "I think I'm finally starting to understand, Rick. And I think it's enough." Rick nodded, the words settling in his chest. For so long he had believed that he needed to be more, that he needed to control the chaos of the universe. But now, in this moment, he realized that the greatest thing he could do was let go. Let the world be as it was. Let the silence be enough. The sun outside had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room, but neither Rick nor Morty felt the need to go anywhere. The world could continue, but they didn't need to follow it anymore. They had already found what they were looking for, in the quiet, in the stillness, and for Rick that was more than enough. The light outside had softened, fading into the gentle hues of dusk as the world below continued its rhythm. But inside the room, time felt suspended. Rick and Morty still sat together, their presence grounding the space between them. No words were needed now, not to fill the silence nor to answer the unspoken questions that had once pushed them forward. There was nothing left to chase, nothing left to fix. The stillness had settled deep within them both, and in that silence there was a quiet comfort, a shared understanding of where they had been and where they no longer needed to go. Rick leaned, back in his chair, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He could feel the weight of the past lifting from him with each passing moment, but it wasn't a burden. It was a freedom, one he hadn't known he could feel. His thoughts didn't race anymore, didn't need to race. There were no more grand ideas to be had, no more worlds to conquer. There was just this, just the room, the quiet, and Morty. "You ever wonder if this is what it was all about, Morty?" Rick asked, his voice soft, almost hesitant, as though he were testing the question in his own mind. Morty, who had been lost in his own thoughts, turned to him slowly, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I think we've been figuring it out, Rick. Maybe we've been chasing the wrong things for a long time, but maybe it was always this. It's about the quiet moments, about being here, about not running from it." Rick nodded, absorbing Morty's words, letting them settle into his chest like a revelation. "I spent so long thinking it. Had to be about something more," Rick said, his voice quieter now, a touch of wonder in his tone. "I thought I had to be bigger, do more, but it turns out this is enough. We don't need anything else." Morty's eyes softened as he met Rick's gaze, the understanding between them deepening. "Yeah, I think we've always had what we needed. It was just about letting go of everything else." Rick smiled, the expression small but genuine. Morty had always been the one to follow, to question, to search. But in this moment, it felt like Morty had come to a place of peace that Rick had only just begun to understand. They had both been searching, both running, both struggling against something they couldn't quite name. And now, in the quiet, they realized that they had already found what they needed. "It's funny, isn't it?" Rick mused, his voice carrying the soft edge of realization. "All those years spent looking for answers, thinking that peace was something I had to fight for. And now? Now I see that peace was never out there. It was always right here, right in the quiet, in the stillness." Morty shifted in his seat, his gaze drifting toward the window where the last light of the day was fading, leaving the room. Bathed in soft twilight. "Maybe that's the biggest lesson we've learned, Rick. It's not about finding the answers or running to the next thing. It's about being okay with not knowing, about accepting what is." Rick let out a long, slow breath, feeling the weight of those words settle in. For so long, he had believed that to be something, to matter, he had to always have the answers. But now, in the peace of the room, in the quiet between them, he understood. The answers weren't important. The only thing that mattered was that they were here, in this moment, together. And that was enough. "Yeah," Rick said quietly, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. "I think you're right. And I think it's time to stop looking for the answers." The night outside deepened, the stars now visible in the sky above, but Rick didn't feel the usual pull toward them. They were no longer a distant, unreachable thing. They were simply part of the world, just like everything else. And for the first time, Rick realized that the universe didn't need to be fixed, didn't need to be understood. It was simply there, and that was enough. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was full of understanding, full of peace. Neither of them needed to rush anywhere, to do anything. The world was moving around them, but they had already found their place in it. A place of stillness, of acceptance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity in the best possible way, Rick stood, stretching his arms above his head with a soft groan. Morty followed suit, and the two of them moved toward the window once more. The city below was quieter now, the sounds of the day fading into the night. The stars above seemed to shimmer a little brighter, not as distant or unreachably vast as they once did. They were simply there, part of the same world they had come to understand. Rick turned to Morty, his expression soft but filled with something deeper. "I think we've done it, Morty. I think we've finally found our place." Morty smiled, the same calm understanding reflected in his eyes. "Yeah, I think we have." They stood there for a long time, side by side, watching the world below, the quiet of the night wrapping around them like a blanket. The universe continued its endless dance, but for Rick and Morty the chase was over. They had already found what they were looking for. And that, more than anything, was enough. The night deepened slowly, the silence around them only growing more comfortable as time passed. Rick and Morty, standing by the window, had found their place in the quiet. The world below continued its dance, people going about their routines, the distant hum of the city, the soft whisper of the wind outside. But inside the room, it felt as though everything had slowed to match their pace. They no longer needed to rush or even think ahead. The simplicity of the moment was enough. Rick's thoughts drifted, but not in the way they used to. He wasn't analyzing, overthinking, or calculating. He wasn't searching for meaning in the stars or in the chaos of the universe. It was as though his mind had quieted, and for once the noise of the world had stopped clamoring for his attention. In that moment, it wasn't about finding answers or solving puzzles. It was about embracing the stillness and accepting that it didn't need to be filled with anything more than what already was. Rick could feel the weight of years lifting from him. Years spent running, years spent chasing things that never seemed to come close enough. "I used to think the universe was just something to figure out," Rick said, his voice barely a murmur. "Like there was this great mystery I had to solve. Like if I could just find the right answer, everything would make sense." Morty, who had been standing beside him, looked up, the soft glow of the streetlights outside reflecting in his eyes. He said nothing for a moment, letting Rick's words linger. It wasn't the first time they'd spoken of the past, but it felt different now, less like a confession and more like an acknowledgement of something shared. "And now?" Morty asked, his voice calm as though the answer was already in the air between them. Rick paused, turning his gaze from the window to Morty. He looked at him for a long time, seeing the boy who had once followed him without question, without understanding. But Morty had changed, grown in ways Rick hadn't always noticed. He was no longer the anxious, uncertain kid who had just stumbled along on their wild adventures. Morty had learned something Rick had only just begun to grasp. "Now," Rick said slowly, "I think maybe the mystery isn't meant to be solved. Maybe it's not about finding an answer. Maybe it's just about being part of it. The universe, the world, it's all already here, Morty. It's not something you need to chase or fix, it's something you just live in." Morty nodded, a slow, thoughtful nod. "Yeah, it's like we've been trying to outrun something, but we didn't need to. Maybe the best thing we can do is just let it be." Rick's heart swelled with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: contentment. For so long, he had been driven by the need to understand everything, to control the chaos. But now, there was peace in the quiet acceptance. He didn't need to fix anything. He didn't need to control the universe. He just needed to live in it. "Maybe the only thing we've been missing," Rick said softly, "is the ability to just stop, to just let go." The words seemed to float in the air between them, not rushed, not demanding a response, but simply an understanding. Rick didn't need to explain himself. Morty didn't need to ask questions. They both understood, without words, that the chase was over. The answers, if they even existed, weren't as important as the moments they shared. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The city outside, the world beyond the room, seemed distant. There was no urgency now, no rush to fill the silence with plans, ideas, or questions. There was only this: the moment. Finally, Rick broke the stillness, but not with the urgency that used to mark his thoughts. It was a quiet question, one that felt almost like a reflection rather than an inquiry. "Do you think we'll ever need to leave here, Morty? I mean, for real? To go anywhere? Do anything? Morty thought about it, his eyes focused on the city, lights as if looking for something just beyond them. I don't think so, he said after a pause. I don't think we need to go anywhere else to figure it out. Maybe we've already figured it out. Rick chuckled softly at that, the sound gentle, full of a newfound understanding. He had spent so many years thinking there was something more, something out there waiting for him to find it, something he had to chase. But now, standing here, with Morty, he realized the truth. Everything they needed was already within reach. The answers, the peace, the connection, it was all right here. For the first time, Rick didn't feel like there was something just beyond his grasp. He didn't feel like there was a next big thing to discover. He had already discovered it. And that was enough. The room was bathed in the deepening light of evening, the air cool but inviting. Rick and Morty stood side by side, no longer needing to fill the space with words. The universe, with all its mysteries, no longer seemed so daunting. It wasn't something they had to understand or conquer. It was something they could simply be a part of. For a long while they just stood there together in the quiet, as the world outside moved on, unaware of the peace that had settled in the room. There was no need to chase it, no need to change. The world was as it was, and for once that was enough. Rick turned to Morty then, a small smile on his face, but there was no rush in it. There was no desire to keep moving forward, to keep pushing toward the next goal. They had already arrived. You know, Morty, Rick said softly, I think we've found something bigger than any of the universes we've been to. I think we've found home. Morty smiled, the same calm smile that seemed to reflect everything they had learned together. Yeah, Rick, I think we have. And for the first time, Rick didn't feel the need to say anything more. The words were enough. The silence was enough. They didn't need to go anywhere. They were home. The soft hum of the world outside had faded into a gentle murmur, barely noticeable, as Rick and Morty stood by the window, taking in the quiet. The night had fully settled in, but the stillness in the room felt different now. There was a weightlessness to it, as though time itself had softened, no longer pressing forward with urgency, but lingering comfortably. Rick didn't need to race against it anymore. Neither did Morty. There was no need to fill the space with plans, ideas, or dreams of what might come next. Everything was as it should be, right here, right now. It was a strange feeling, this peace. For so long, Rick had defined his life by motion, by the pursuit of something more, the chase, the adventure, the next grand idea. But now, as the city outside seemed to quiet with the night, Rick realized that the most profound thing he had found wasn't a new world or a new discovery. It was this, the space to simply be, the room to breathe, to accept the world as it was without the need to change it. It was enough. It had always been enough. I never thought I'd be here, Rick said softly, his voice almost a whisper, the words rolling out without the weight of urgency. He wasn't speaking to Morty so much as to himself, to the realization that had slowly unfurled in his chest over the last few hours. I never thought I'd be able to stop, to just be. Morty, still standing beside him, didn't need to answer immediately. There was no need to fill the silence with words. Morty had been on his own journey too. He had seen the same truth, felt the same shift. The world outside could continue. They had already arrived at what they needed. After a long moment, Morty turned his gaze to Rick, his voice calm but with a touch of quiet certainty. I think we're both here, Rick. We've both arrived. Rick let the words settle in, like a weight lifting from his chest. Morty, too, had come to understand the depth of the quiet. The boy had always followed, always looked to Rick for answers, but now he had found his own. Rick hadn't been alone in his journey. Morty had been beside him, growing, learning, evolving in his own way, just as Rick had. They had both come to the same realization, just at different times. And it's enough, Rick said quietly, as if saying it aloud made it more real, more tangible. I think we've been searching for more, but we never had to. The answers were never out there. They were here all along in this moment, Morty smiled, the softest smile that spoke volumes. Yeah, Rick, I think it's enough. The room was bathed in the quiet hum of the night. The air felt lighter, as though the weight of everything they had experienced had finally settled into something peaceful, something lasting. The universe, once so vast and overwhelming, seemed smaller now, not because they had conquered it or understood it completely, but because they had stopped trying to control it. The peace that had settled between them was proof that sometimes the simplest things were the most profound, just being, just living. Rick turned away from the window and walked toward the small desk in the corner of the room. He hadn't really looked at it much lately, too focused on the world outside, on the things he thought he had to do. But now, as he approached, he felt something pull him toward it. There, resting in the corner, was the vial, the one thing that had once felt like the key to everything, the thing that had driven him for so long, the thing he thought would bring him peace. He reached for it, his fingers grazing the smooth glass. It pulsed softly, a faint blue light dancing within. But as Rick held it in his hands, he realized something. The vial was just that, an object. A symbol of all the things he had once thought mattered. It was no longer the answer. He didn't need it anymore. Rick gently placed the vial back on the desk, his fingers lingering for a moment before he stepped back. There was no dramatic moment, no grand realization. It was just letting go. The act felt simple, but it carried more weight than any invention or discovery ever had. For once, Rick didn't need the answers. He didn't need to fix anything. He just needed to exist here in this space. Turning back to Morty, Rick smiled, a smile that held no bitterness, no regret, only peace. I think I've finally let it go, Morty. The thing I thought would solve everything. Morty looked at him, his eyes steady. Yeah, I think you have. And with that, the last of the weight Rick had carried seemed to lift. The world outside could continue. The universe could keep spinning, but Rick didn't need to chase it. He didn't need to control it. He had already found what he needed. He had found peace, and it was enough. The night stretched on, the stars above shimmering like quiet witnesses to the change that had taken place in the room. And for the first time in Rick's life, he was content to let the world be exactly what it was. He had stopped searching, he had stopped running, and with Morty beside him, Rick felt as though he had finally found his place in the universe. A place where he didn't need to outrun anything anymore, where he could simply exist, simply be, and that, he realized, was more than enough. The evening deepened, and the room felt almost suspended in time. The city outside, now cloaked in darkness, hummed with the quiet rhythm of life moving on. But inside, everything had slowed to a peaceful stillness. The world beyond the window, with its constant motion, seemed like an echo now, distant and irrelevant to what had transpired in the room. Rick and Morty were no longer bound by the need to do, to fix, to chase after something just out of reach. They were simply there together in the present. Rick sat in his chair, his gaze once more drifting toward the window. The stars had emerged in the sky, distant and infinite, but this time they didn't pull at him. He didn't feel the need to unlock their secrets or conquer their mysteries. They were just there. Part of the vastness of the universe that didn't need explanation. Part of the world he had finally accepted as it was. "Do you think we'll ever leave this place, Morty?" Rick asked quietly, not out of a desire to move, but out of a gentle curiosity about what came next. The question felt light, almost like a passing thought, but it carried with it a deeper reflection. Morty, who had been standing by the desk, turned to look at Rick. His eyes were steady, calm, the uncertainty that had once defined him now replaced with something else, something quieter, something more sure. "I don't know, Rick," he said after a moment, his voice soft but grounded. "Maybe we don't need to leave. Maybe we're already where we're supposed to be." Rick smiled, a small, almost wistful smile, but one that felt genuine. Morty's words held a weight that he hadn't noticed before. In the past, Morty had always looked to Rick for guidance, for answers. But now in the stillness, it seemed as if Morty had found something Rick hadn't yet. A peace that didn't require answers, that didn't need to race toward the next adventure. It was enough to be here, together. "We've spent a long time thinking we needed to move," Rick said, his voice slow, almost reflective. We thought we had to keep chasing something, always looking for the next thing, the next fix. But maybe that's not what matters. The quiet between them deepened, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't empty. It was a space that allowed for understanding to grow, for the weight of everything they had been through to settle into something real and lasting. I think we've been running in circles, Morty, Rick continued, his gaze distant, as though he were piecing together something he had always known but never truly understood. Always searching for a solution, always thinking that the next thing would finally be the answer. But what if the answer was never about fixing everything? What if it was just about stopping long enough to see what we already have? Morty walked over and sat beside Rick, his gaze following Rick's as they both stared out the window. The city below was calm now, the faint sound of the world continuing, but it felt distant, like it belonged to another time, another place. They were no longer part of that rush. Maybe we've already found it, Rick, Morty said softly. Maybe it's not about finding the next big thing. Maybe the thing we've been looking for has been here all along. Rick looked at Morty, his eyes softening. The boy had grown, not just in the physical sense, but in the way he understood the world. Rick had spent so much of his life running, trying to outrun the consequences, trying to outrun himself. But Morty had learned something Rick hadn't, known how to teach him, something that only the stillness could show. That peace wasn't something to chase. It was something to embrace. Rick nodded slowly. Yeah, maybe it has been. Maybe we were too busy looking for it to realize that we were already here. We've already got what we need. All we have to do is let it be. The silence stretched on, comfortable and steady. There was no more need to rush, no more need to move forward without thought. They had already arrived, not at some far-off destination, but right here in this space, in this moment. It was more than enough. Rick stood then, slowly stretching his legs and feeling the small aches of age, but they didn't bother him now. The pressure to be something else, to do something more, had lifted. He didn't need to prove anything. He didn't need to chase anything. He could simply be. With Morty, with the world as it was. Maybe that's the trick, Rick said, looking down at Morty with a soft smile. Maybe the secret is that we don't need to find a bigger purpose. We don't need to run to the next thing. We just need to be here, to live in the moment. Morty smiled back, his eyes bright with a quiet understanding. I think we're getting it, Rick. I think we're finally here. Rick nodded, the weight of those words settling over him like a blanket. He didn't need to go anywhere. He didn't need to be anyone else. All that mattered was this moment. And that was enough. As the night deepened, the stars outside grew brighter, but they no longer held the same allure. They were just part of the sky, part of the world, just as he was part of it. The universe didn't need to be fixed. It just needed to be lived in. And for the first time, Rick could accept that he could finally be part of it, without trying to change it. Rick turned back to Morty, a quiet peace settling over him. We're okay, Morty. We're exactly where we need to be. And for once, Rick knew that it was true. There was nothing more to chase, nothing more to prove. They had found their place in the universe, and that in itself was everything. The soft hum of the world outside continued, a constant background to the stillness in the room. The sky had darkened now, the stars outside twinkling faintly as the moon's light bathed everything in a quiet glow. Inside, the silence was no longer something Rick had to endure. It was something he could live in, something that made the world feel a little smaller, a little more manageable. There were no grand expectations hanging in the air, no unfinished business demanding his attention. There was only this moment, and in that, Rick felt a strange kind of peace. He stood for a while by the window, his gaze lost in the darkness, beyond, but not in the way it used to be. He wasn't searching for something, some hidden meaning in the vastness of the universe. He was simply here, present, breathing in the night air as if for the first time in years. The weight of the world had lifted, but it wasn't a loss, it was freedom. I always thought that there was something I had to find, Rick said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question or an answer, just a thought aloud, the kind that had been building inside him ever since the quiet had begun to settle. Something bigger, Something out there that would make it all make sense, but now I see that it was never out there. It was here, in this, in the quiet, in the moments we've shared. Morty, who had been sitting across the room, watching, Rick, with the same steady gaze, stood up slowly and walked over to join him. His footsteps were quiet, almost as though the air itself was absorbing the sound. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside Rick, looking out at the same view the same night. "I think I've been chasing the wrong thing for a long time," Rick continued, his voice softer now, as if the realization were settling deep into his bones. "I thought I had to have all the answers. I thought if I could just solve it, everything would fall into place. But now I see. I was looking in the wrong direction. The answers were never the point. The point was to stop looking, to just be." Morty nodded, the understanding in his expression clear. "I get it now too, Rick. We don't need to go somewhere else, be someone else, or find anything new. We've already found it. It's here." Rick glanced over at Morty, the words coming easily now. "Yeah, I think we've been searching for the wrong things our whole lives, Morty. We've been looking for something to fix, but maybe what we needed wasn't fixing at all. Maybe we just needed to be okay with it, to let it be." The two of them stood there in the quiet, letting the night wrap itself around them. It was strange to feel so unhurried, so still. Rick had spent so many years fighting, chasing, solving. But now, as the world outside seemed to sleep, he found that he didn't need to do any of those things anymore. It was enough to just be here, to be with Morty, to let go. The city below, once something Rick had felt so disconnected from, now seemed so distant in the best possible way. It was moving, alive, but Rick felt no urge to jump into it. There was no rush to be a part of it anymore, no need to be ahead. Say of it, the peace was in the acceptance that it would go on without him, and that was perfectly fine. For once, Rick didn't need to control it. He didn't need to chase after it. He could simply watch it from here and know that he was part of it just by being here. "You ever wonder if we've been missing something, Morty?" Rick asked, the question floating into the stillness, but not in an urgent way, more like a simple curiosity about the quiet life they had found. "Something that we never knew was important until now." Morty's gaze shifted from the window back to Rick, his expression calm, thoughtful. "Yeah, I think we were missing the quiet. We were always so focused on the noise, on the big things, that we never noticed the little things, the ones that really matter." Rick smiled softly, the weight of the years they had spent in motion, always searching, lifting from him as he spoke. "Yeah, I think we were looking for the wrong answers, and in the process we missed everything that was right in front of us." They stood together for a while, the quiet stretching on between them, but not in an uncomfortable way. There was no need to fill it, no need to explain. The understanding was enough. They didn't need to change anything. They didn't need to run. The stillness, the peace was theirs now, and there was no need to search for it anymore. Rick let out a slow breath, the air around him feeling lighter than it ever had before. For the first time in his life, he felt free. Free from the chase, free from the need to fix, free from the constant pressure to be someone else. He had finally found what he had been looking for, not in the vastness of the universe, not in the mysteries of the multiverse, but right here, in this room, with Morty. "You know, Morty," Rick said quietly, turning slightly to face him, "I think we've been looking at life all wrong. It's not about solving everything. It's about living in it. It's about being here without the need to change a single thing." Morty smiled, the same calm smile that seemed to reflect everything they had learned together. "Yeah, Rick. So I think we've finally figured it out." Rick nodded slowly, his chest filled with a warmth that had been absent for so long. The peace, the quiet. They weren't something to fear. They were everything. And for once, Rick understood that. It wasn't the end of the road. It was the beginning of something new, something that didn't require running or chasing or fighting. It just required being. And that, Rick realized, was more than enough. The evening air, cool and quiet, filtered through the open window, brushing against Rick's face like a soft reminder of the world outside. But even with the night growing deeper, neither Rick nor Morty felt the need to join it. The city below continued its slow hum, but the pace felt distant now, like an echo from another time, from another life they no longer needed to chase. It was as though they had finally found the pause that had been missing for so long, the pause that Rick had spent a lifetime running from. Rick sat back down in the chair, his hands resting lightly on the arms, not tense, but relaxed in a way he hadn't known how to be. He wasn't planning the next big thing, or analyzing some complex equation, or thinking about the next invention. He wasn't thinking about anything. For the first time, he felt no pressure, no need to reach for the next idea, the next place. He was simply here. Morty, who had been standing quietly by the window, joined Rick again, his footsteps quiet but certain. He seemed at ease, a steady calmness radiating from him, the kind of peace that came with understanding, not just the world but himself. The boy who had once been filled with questions, with uncertainty, had become someone Rick could stand beside in the silence, someone who had learned to let go of the need to fix, to control, to chase. Rick glanced over at him, noticing the subtle change in Morty that had crept up on him without either of them truly realizing it. Morty had found his own sense of peace, just as Rick had. They had both arrived at this moment together, without needing to chase it, without needing to force anything. They had simply been, and in that they had found everything. "So what now, Rick?" Morty asked softly, his voice carrying no urgency, no question to fill the silence with noise. It was a simple question, but one that hung in the air, full of the understanding they had come to share. It wasn't about what came next. It was about the fact that they were already where they needed to be. Rick looked at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I don't know, Morty, but I don't think it matters. Maybe we've been thinking too hard about what comes next, about what we're supposed to do. Maybe the real answer is just being here." Morty nodded slowly, as though the weight of Rick's words had settled into him just as deeply. "Yeah, I think so too. I think we've been so focused on trying to get somewhere, to be something, that we forgot that we're already here. We've already found it?" Rick let the silence fall between them again, but it wasn't empty. It was full, rich with the understanding that they had both reached. The world outside could continue its course, could rush forward as it always had, but Rick didn't feel the need to chase it anymore. He had found what he needed. They had found it, together. The stars outside shimmered softly, distant and far away, but no longer something to reach for. They were just there, part of the vast, endless world that didn't require an explanation, that didn't require control. It simply was, just like them, just like this moment. Rick stood, stretching slowly, feeling the subtle creak in his joints, the small aches that came with age, but they didn't bother him. He wasn't rushing anywhere, he wasn't moving toward something. He simply moved. It was enough. "You know, Morty," Rick said, his voice soft, as if he were speaking more to the room than to Morty, "I think we've spent so much of our lives trying to figure it out, chasing, solving, finding answers. But maybe the answer isn't something to be figured out. Maybe it's just to be, just to live." Morty stood beside him, the understanding between them deepening with every word. "Yeah, it's like we've been running for so long, thinking that we had to fix it all. But maybe the only thing we had to do was just stop." Rick smiled faintly, the weight of everything he had ever thought about life and purpose lifting from his chest. It was a strange, simple revelation, one that didn't need grand words or dramatic moments to feel complete. The answer wasn't in the chase, it was in the pause. The evening air had grown cooler, but neither of them felt the need to go anywhere. The world outside could continue its dance, its endless movement, but they were no longer part of that race. They had already found their place, and in that stillness, in that quiet understanding, there was more peace than Rick had ever thought possible. "I think we've arrived, Morty," Rick said quietly, almost as though he were speaking to the night itself. "We're here." Morty turned to him, a smile soft and knowing. "Yeah, I think we are." They stood there together, side by side, watching the world outside, but not needing to be a part of it anymore. The universe, with all its complexity, was no longer something they needed to conquer. It was simply something they could exist within. They didn't need to control it. They didn't need to fix it. They were already a part of it, just as it was a part of them. And for the first time, Rick realized that that was more than enough. The quiet of the night stretched on, the stillness in the room almost tangible. The weight of everything Rick had spent his life chasing had lifted, leaving only the space to breathe, space to simply be. The world outside, with its unending hum and rush, no longer felt like something Rick had to conquer. It just existed, as it always had. And for once, Rick didn't feel the need to fight it or change it. He could simply exist within it, part of it, without the pressure of constantly needing to do more. Morty, still beside him, seemed to share the same realization. He stood quietly by the window, not looking for answers, not asking what came next, but simply being in the moment. There was a quiet strength in that, a maturity that Rick hadn't always seen in him before. Morty had always been the one who followed, who questioned, who wondered what came next. But now Morty was standing here with him, not asking, just understanding. Rick's gaze shifted back to Morty, watching him with a soft smile. "You know, Morty," Rick said quietly, his voice more reflective than it had ever been, "I spent my whole life thinking that I had to be someone else. Someone bigger, someone who could change things. But now I realize I never needed to be anyone other than who I was." Morty turned to face him, his expression thoughtful but calm, his eyes steady. "Yeah, I think we both tried to be more than what we needed to be. But maybe what we needed most was just to be here, to just be ourselves." Rick nodded, the weight of his own words sinking in. The stillness had allowed him to finally see it. For all the years spent running from the past, from the mistakes, from the fear of not being enough, he had never stopped to see that he was already enough. He didn't need to change the world to be at peace with it. He didn't need to fix it. It was enough as it was. And that in itself was a revelation. The world outside seemed to move slower now, almost as if it were aware of the peace that had settled inside the room. The stars twinkled quietly in the sky, distant and vast, but no longer overwhelming. They were just part of the same world. Rick and Morty had come to accept. No longer something to chase, something to conquer, just something to witness, just something to be part of. "I guess we've been looking in the wrong places, Morty," Rick said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent searching. Maybe it was never about fixing anything. Maybe it was about letting go, about realizing that what we needed was always right here, in front of us. Morty smiled, a quiet understanding in his eyes. "Yeah, Rick. I think we've been running for so long, but now I get it. We don't need to chase anything anymore. We've already found it." Rick turned toward the window again, watching the city below. It was a familiar view, one he had seen countless times, but now it felt different. The lights, the movement, the hum of life, it no longer felt like something he needed to be part of, to control, to understand. It was just there, part of the world, a world that didn't need fixing, a world that could keep turning with, or without him. "You know," Rick murmured, his voice almost wistful, "there was a time when I would have looked at all of this and thought it was empty, thought it was pointless. But now it feels like everything. Just being here. Just living in it." Morty joined him at the window, standing beside him without saying a word. There was no need for words now. They both understood. The world would continue as it always did, but Rick and Morty no longer felt like they were chasing it. They had already arrived together in a place where the answers didn't matter, the questions didn't matter. What mattered was the quiet, the stillness, the connection between them. Rick felt the weight of a lifetime of struggles, questions, and uncertainty slowly dissolve. It wasn't that the past didn't matter, it was that it no longer defined him. He had let go of the need to fix, to search for meaning, to chase the next big adventure. He was part of it all, as simple and as complex as the world outside. And that was enough. The room, the city, the night, it all felt a little more peaceful now. Not because it had changed, but because Rick had changed. He had stopped running, he had stopped fighting. And in that, he had found something more profound than any invention, any discovery, any adventure. Rick turned to Morty, his eyes softer now, filled with a quiet kind of gratitude. I don't think I've ever said this, Morty, but I'm proud of you. For everything. Morty looked at Rick, his eyes steady but the faintest of smiles tugging at the corner of his mouth. I'm proud of you too, Rick. You don't have to do it all. We don't have to do it all. We just have to be here. The world outside continued its endless movement, but Rick and Morty no longer needed to race with it. They had already found their place. They had already arrived. The stars shone down quietly, a soft, timeless reminder of the world's rhythm, but Rick didn't feel the pull of them anymore. He didn't need to chase them, to understand them. They were just part of the universe. He had finally learned to live in, and for once that was more than enough. The room, still bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight, felt like the last remaining bastion of calm in a world that continued to move at its usual pace. Rick and Morty stood side by the window, the city below still bustling, but neither of them felt the need to rush, to join in, or to fill the space with noise. There was no longer any expectation to chase the next thing, to search for answers to fight or conquer. The silence between them was no longer a void. It was something full, rich with the understanding they had both come to share. It was strange, Rick thought, how simple it all seemed now. All those years spent trying to be someone else, trying to outrun the mistakes, the regrets, the chaos of the universe. And yet here they were in this quiet room at peace, with nothing more to prove, nothing to fix. It was a peace that was hard to put into words, but it was real. More real than any adventure, any invention Rick had ever created. The sea, stars outside shimmered gently in the sky, but Rick no longer felt the compulsion to look deeper into their mysteries. He didn't need to chase after them. They were just stars. Part of the vastness of the universe that he had spent so long trying to understand, and now he realized there was nothing to understand. The stars were just there, and that was enough. The universe was enough. I used to think that understanding everything was the point, Rick said quietly, as though the words were finally coming together in his mind, as though they had been waiting to be said all along. I thought that if I could just solve it, find the right answer, it would make everything make sense. But now I see that maybe it's not about understanding everything. Maybe it's about accepting it, just letting it be. Morty, who had been quietly standing beside him, turned his head to look at Rick, his face calm, but with the same quiet understanding that had come to define him over the course of this strange, transformative journey. Yeah, Morty replied, his voice steady and soft. Maybe it's never been about solving anything. Maybe it's just about living in it, accepting it. Rick smiled faintly at Morty's words. For so long, he had tried to push away the chaos, the uncertainty, the things he couldn't control. But now, standing beside Morty in this stillness, he realized that he had never needed to fix the world. It wasn't something that could be fixed. It wasn't something that needed to be fixed. It just was. And in that acceptance, in that realization, there was a profound peace. We've spent so much time searching for answers, Morty, Rick continued, his voice quieter now, almost contemplative. But maybe the answers were never out there. Maybe they were inside us all along. Maybe we've always known what we needed, but we just didn't want to see it. Morty's expression softened, his gaze turning toward the quiet city below. There was a sense of stillness in him now that Rick hadn't always noticed before. The boy had grown, learned, and in this moment Morty seemed to understand something deeper than the noise of the world. Yeah, I think we've been too focused on the wrong things, Morty said slowly. Maybe we've been looking for answers outside of us, when all we really needed to do was stop. To just be here. Rick looked at Morty, his heart light with the truth that had taken so long to come to. The boy had found his peace just as Rick had. They had both arrived here to this moment, together. There was nothing more to find, nothing more to chase. It's funny, Rick said with a soft chuckle, his gaze still fixed on Morty. I spent so many years thinking I had to fix things, thinking that I had to find the answers. But now I see that the only thing I ever needed to fix was the way I looked at it all. The answers weren't out there, they were right here in this. Morty nodded, the quiet understanding between them settling even deeper. Yeah, he said simply. Right here. With you. The two of them stood there for a long while, looking out at the world below them, but not feeling the pull of it anymore. It was moving, sure, but it no longer demanded anything from them. It no longer felt like something they had to control or fight. It simply was. Rick turned away from the window, the quiet room stretching out around them. He felt lighter now, not because the world had changed, but because he had changed. He didn't need to search for anything anymore. He didn't need to outrun it. He was here in this moment, and that was enough. I think I'm finally ready to just be," Rick said softly, the weight of the words wrapping around him like a comfortable blanket. "Ready to stop, to let go." Morty turned to face him, a small smile on his face. "Me too, Rick. I think I'm finally ready to stop running." Rick smiled back, the simple understanding between them wrapping itself around him like a quiet reassurance. He didn't need to be someone else anymore. He didn't need to chase after the next big thing. He didn't need to outrun the world. He just needed to exist in it. And for the first time, he understood that that was enough. The room felt full, not of noise or chaos, but of a kind of stillness that Rick had never allowed himself to feel before. The world outside could continue, could do its thing, but Rick didn't need to be a part of it anymore. He was already part of it. In this quiet, in this stillness, Rick realized that everything he had ever searched for was right here. Right now, and that was more than enough. The night stretched on, and with it, a deeper sense of peace settled in the room, weaving itself into every corner like a soft, comforting blanket. The city outside continued to hum with the quiet rhythm of life, but it felt so distant now, like the background noise of a dream that Rick and Morty had both stepped away from. They no longer felt the need to chase after it, to be a part of its rush. The rush had stopped for them. In the stillness, there was something more profound than any pursuit of answers or adventure. Rick sat back in the chair, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his eyes half closed as he let the quiet fill him. He wasn't trying to figure out the next step. He wasn't wondering where the journey would lead or how he could change things. He wasn't even thinking about the past, the mistakes, or the roads that had led him here. He was simply here, in the moment, and for once that was enough. Beside him, Morty stood by the window again, his posture relaxed, no longer filled with the restlessness that had once defined him. He had learned over time, what Rick had only recently realized, that peace wasn't something to chase but something to embrace. Morty wasn't the anxious, uncertain boy who had followed Rick into countless worlds. He was someone who had found his own way, someone who had learned to stop running. Rick glanced at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. Morty met his gaze and returned the smile, a silent understanding passing between them. They didn't need words anymore. The realization was enough. "You know, Morty," Rick began softly, breaking the quiet with a thought that had been forming in his mind, "I used to think that every adventure, every world we visited was a chance to fix something, to find something, to make sense of it all. But I've realized it wasn't about fixing anything, it was about living in it, just being part of it." Morty nodded, his eyes steady. "Yeah, Rick. It's like we've been looking for something to fix, thinking we could change it all. But maybe what we needed was to just accept it, to be okay with it." The simplicity of Morty's words, the way they so perfectly mirrored Rick's own realization, made Rick pause. He had spent so many years believing that peace could only be found after all the problems were solved, after all the adventures were over. But now he understood. Peace wasn't something that came after the chase. It was something that existed in the middle of it, in the stillness between the movements, in the quiet moments that passed unnoticed. The weight of it, the understanding, settled deeper inside him. He didn't need to fix the world, and he certainly didn't need to chase it. He was already part of it. He didn't need to prove anything or find any more answers. The world would keep moving, but he didn't need to race with it. It was enough to simply be here, to simply exist in it. Rick leaned back in his chair, the weight of his thoughts finally settling into something soft and content. He closed his eyes for a moment, just letting the quiet fill him, just being. For once, there was no restlessness in his chest, no compulsion to figure it all out. The questions, the struggles, the search, it had all been part of the journey, but it wasn't the journey anymore. The journey had ended, and this right here was the answer. "I think we've finally found it, Morty," Rick said after a while, his voice soft but steady. "We found what we've been looking for. And it was never something to chase. It was something to accept." Morty didn't need to say anything. He simply stood there beside Rick, a small smile on his face, his gaze out the window. There was nothing more to say. They both understood, and that understanding was enough. The world didn't need to be fixed, and they didn't need to chase it. They were here, and that was enough. For the first time in Rick's life, he felt the weight of everything he had been running from ease into something lighter, something softer. The burden of always needing to be more, always needing to find the next thing had finally lifted. He was no longer searching for meaning in the vastness of the universe. The meaning had always been here, in the moments, in the stillness. It had been there all along, waiting for him to stop chasing it. The stars outside twinkled gently, their distant light casting a quiet glow on the room, but Rick didn't feel the pull of them anymore. They were just stars, beautiful, distant, part of the universe, but he no longer needed to conquer them. They were simply there, just as he was simply here. He looked at Morty, his chest lighter than it had ever been. "You know, Morty," Rick said softly, the words finally coming with ease, "I think we've found something more than any adventure, more than any world. We've found peace, and that's all we really needed." Morty looked at him, his eyes calm and steady, a quiet understanding reflected in his expression. "Yeah, Rick, I think we've found it." The two of them stood there together, side by side, as the world outside continued its rhythm. But inside, in the quiet of the room, everything had shifted. The chase was over. The answers were no longer the point. They had already found what they needed. They had found peace. And for once, Rick realized that was more than enough. The night deepened, the quiet settling into every corner of the room like the softest embrace. Outside, the world continued its endless hum, but within the walls of the room, there was only stillness. Rick and Morty stood side by side, each of them feeling the weight of everything they had been through slowly melt away. They had reached a point where the future didn't matter, where there were no more worlds to conquer, no more questions to answer. For the first time, they were just here. Rick shifted slightly, the quiet of the moment pressing against him. He felt lighter now, like a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had finally lifted. The desire to keep moving, to solve, to chase had dissipated. All that remained was the space they had created together, and it was enough. "You know, Morty," Rick said, his voice quiet, but filled with a kind of warmth he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I used to think that finding answers was everything, that solving things, understanding them, was the key to it all." He paused, looking down at the floor as if collecting his thoughts. "But now I see. It's not the answers that matter. It's the living. It's the being. It's the moments we share." Morty, still standing beside him, turned his head slightly to look at Rick. The boy had grown, had changed in ways Rick hadn't fully seen until now. No longer was he the nervous, anxious child who stumbled through the chaos, unsure of himself. Now Morty stood here, steady and calm, the quiet wisdom of everything they'd experienced between them reflected in his eyes. "Yeah," Morty replied, softly, the depth of his understanding clear in his voice. "I think that's what we've both been missing. We've been so focused on fixing everything, making it all right, that we forgot what really matters. Just being with each other, that's enough." Rick nodded slowly, feeling a sense of peace settle deep into his chest. He wasn't running anymore, wasn't trying to outrun time or the endless pressure to be something he wasn't. He had finally stopped, finally allowed himself to exist, without the need to constantly strive. The weight of that realization was almost overwhelming, but in the best way. For once, he didn't need to be anyone other than who he was, right here, in this moment. The stars outside twinkled in the deep. Black sky, their light distant but steady. It was a reminder of the vastness of the universe, but it no longer felt intimidating. It no longer felt like something Rick needed to understand, control, or change. It was simply there, part of the world he had come to accept. He was part of it, and for the first time that felt enough. "You know, Morty," Rick said, the words coming with a soft finality, I think I've spent my whole life chasing after the wrong things. I thought the answers were out there, that if I could just figure it all out it would make sense, but now I think the real answer was always right here, right in front of us." Morty smiled, a soft smile that seemed to reflect everything they had both come to understand. It wasn't a smile filled with excitement or the need for anything more. It was a smile of acceptance, of peace. "Yeah, I think it's always been here, Rick. We just had to stop long enough to see it." Rick felt the truth of Morty's words settled deeply into his heart. They had both been running for so long, caught in a cycle of searching for something that was always just out of reach. But now, they had found it. They had found the stillness, the peace that came from letting go of the chase. They didn't need to race forward anymore. They didn't need to find something else to fix. They were already here. And that was enough. The world outside could keep moving, keep changing, but Rick no longer felt the need to be part of it. The noise, the chaos, it was no longer his to control. He could just watch it, live in it, be a part of it, without needing to change it. And that, Rick realized, was freedom. A freedom he hadn't known he could have, and yet here it was. He glanced over at Morty, his chest swelling with something soft, something like gratitude, something like pride. Morty had always been the one to follow, to watch, to learn from Rick's mistakes. But now, standing together, they were equals in a way Rick had never fully seen before. Morty had found his own way, his own peace, and that was something Rick had never imagined. "You've grown up, Morty," Rick said softly, his voice full of quiet affection. "You've really grown up." Morty looked at him, his eyes steady, his expression calm. "So have you, Rick. So have you." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of understanding, full of acceptance. They didn't need to speak any more words. They had arrived. They were here. And that was more than enough. Rick stood for a moment, the air around him feeling light and easy. The pressure to move, to fix, to chase had all melted away. It was just him and Morty, standing side by side, sharing the moment. And for the first time in his life, Rick felt no need to move ahead. There was nowhere to go, nothing left to prove. He turned toward Morty, a soft smile still on his face. "I think we're done running, Morty. I think we found it." Morty smiled back, a quiet joy in his expression. "Yeah, Rick, we've found it." The night stretched on, the world outside still moving, still changing, but for Rick and Morty it no longer mattered. They had found what they needed. They had found peace. And that, in the end, was more than enough.